Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're exploring some of the greatest mysteries in human history, the civilizations that rose, flourished, and then disappeared. Long before our modern nations and cities, there were entire cultures that built monuments, invented writing, sailed oceans, and studied the stars, only to vanish from the map. Some left behind ruins in the desert, others were swallowed by the jungle, and some slipped quietly into legend. From the Indus Valley to the Maya, from forgotten islands in the Pacific to lost kingdoms in Africa, these are the stories of civilizations that once shaped the world and then faded into silence. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're here to unwind, fall asleep, or simply wander through the past, I'm glad you're with me. Now, let's begin. On the vast Konya plain of central Anatolia, where the horizon rolls unbroken beneath a restless sky, the story of one of humanity's earliest towns began. Here, almost 9,000 years ago, people built something new upon the earth. They had learned to tame the wild grains of the steppe, to corral goats and sheep, to draw life from the soil rather than chase it across the endless grasslands. Out of this shift from forager to farmer rose Çatalhöyük, a settlement so strange and yet so familiar that it still bewilders us. It began around 7,500 BCE, a cluster of mud brick homes rising side by side on a gentle mound above the plain. The people of Çatalhöyük were farmers, but they were also hunters. They sowed wheat and barley, gathered peas and lentils, and kept herds of sheep and goats whose bleating echoed among the reed beds of a vanished river. Yet their hearts were not wholly tethered to domestication. They still stalked aurochs across the plains and drew blood from wild boar in the marshes. Theirs was a world balanced precariously between the old ways of the hunt and the new order of agriculture. It was this tension that gave Çatalhöyük its character and perhaps its power. Unlike the later cities of Mesopotamia, Çatalhöyük had no streets, no open boulevards. Instead, the houses pressed tight against one another in a great honeycomb of mud and timber, each dwelling sharing walls with its neighbors. To move through the town, one did not walk along roads, but climbed onto the rooftops, passing from one flat roof to the next, beneath the Anatolian sunday. Entry was gained not by doors on the ground, but by ladders lowered through openings in the ceiling. This rooftop world was both thoroughfare and marketplace. One can imagine women gossiping as they pounded grain with stone mortars, children chasing each other between hearth smoke vents, and men carrying obsidian blades that gleamed like frozen black fire in the light. Inside the houses, life was lived in small, intimate chambers, plastered white with lime, and painted again and again in ochre and charcoal. Some walls bore images of wild hunts, vultures swooping down on headless corpses, or great bulls charging across crimson fields. Others were hung with the horns and skulls of aurochs, deer, or rams, trophies transformed into sacred icons. In these rooms, the living shared their space with the dead. Burials took place beneath the very platforms, where families slept. Generations lay layered in the soil beneath, their presence a constant reminder of ancestry and obligation. Children, elders, mothers, hunters, all were folded back into the home, their bones sometimes painted, or their skulls dug up and replastered as if to bring them into communion once more with the living. Çatalhöyük was not a city of kings. There were no palaces, no monuments to rulers, no grand temples rising above the roofs. Instead, it was a city of equals, or so it appears. Each household was its own center of life, producing its own food, making its own tools, burying its own dead. The archaeological record reveals little sign of hierarchy. There is no district of mansions, no evidence of lords commanding peasants. Instead, the town was bound together by shared beliefs, rituals, and the close press of daily survival. Its strength lay in community. Its cohesion rested in the hearths that glowed red within each home, and the ceremonies that bound them together in times of feast and famine. This was also a town of artists and artisans. They molded figurines of corpulent goddesses, perhaps symbols of fertility or protectors of the home. They carved obsidian into daggers sharp enough to cut flesh and bone with terrifying ease. They wove textiles from wool and plant fibers, so fine that their impressions remain on clay to this day. The earth beneath Çatal Höyük was rich in volcanic glass, and this dark material became their passport to a wider world. Traders carried obsidian across Anatolia, and in return foreign goods trickled back to the town. In this way, Çatal Höyük became not only a settlement, but a hub, a place where new ideas and objects passed, leaving behind traces that still speak to us across millennia. As centuries rolled on, the settlement swelled to house perhaps 5,000 souls, maybe more. In the Neolithic world, that was an astonishing number. Nowhere else in Europe or Asia were so many gathered together under one sky. From afar, Çatal Höyük would have appeared as a great mound, its rooftops crowded, its fires flickering against the night. To live there was to be part of something new and fragile, a human hive in which daily life was dense, intimate, and communal. It was one of the world's first great experiments in urban living, a blueprint whose echoes can still be traced in the crowded alleys and stacked dwellings of cities today. And yet, despite all this closeness, Çatal Höyük was not anonymous. Every hearth told its own story. Every wall painting held the memory of a family's devotion. Every burial placed beneath the floor tied the living to their ancestors. It was a place where the sacred and the ordinary intertwined. A loaf of bread was both sustenance and offering. A hunt was both survival and ritual. To rise each morning was to live in the company of the dead, and to die was to remain in the company of the living. This was Çatal Höyük in its rise. Neither a kingdom nor an empire, but a crucible of human ingenuity and imagination. From its mud and plaster walls emerged new ways of living that would ripple outward into the future. It stood at the threshold between village and city, between old ways and new, between the world of the hunter and the age of the farmer. For nearly 2 millennia it endured, a testament to what humans could build when they came together in trust, faith, and necessity. By the 7th millennium before the Common Era, Çatal Höyük had swelled into a settlement unparalleled in its age. Where once there had been a scattering of huts upon the Konya plain, there now stood a sprawling mound that glowed with hearth smoke and the murmur of thousands. At its height, between 5,000 and 8,000 souls lived pressed close within those mud-brick walls, a population density so great that by the measures of the ancient world, it was astonishing. From a distance, the town must have seemed like a hive upon the earth, a dense and living thing, its flat roofs rising tier upon tier, its walls shining white where plaster caught the sun. Life was lived upon those rooftops, for there were no streets as we understand them. The roof was both thoroughfare and marketplace, the place of gossip and encounter, the path by which one traveled from neighbor to neighbor. To descend into the house was to step into a chambered cave of humanity's earliest urban experiment. Each home was small, but carefully kept, its walls smoothed and painted with lime plaster, its floors renewed again and again as generations passed. In the corner, a clay oven glowed red, its smoke venting through the roof hole. Against the wall lay bins of barley and emmer, lentils and peas, precious stores that gave life through winter. Everywhere, the scent of grain dust and baked bread mingled with the sharper smell of hides and wool. The houses of Çatalhöyük were not just dwellings, they were shrines. The walls bore vivid paintings of hunters chasing deer, of vultures hovering over human forms, of geometric designs whose meaning is lost to us, but which must have been filled with power. Many homes displayed bull horns and skulls embedded in their walls, painted and replastered over centuries until they gleamed like pale bone rising from red earth. Such trophies of the wild were not simply decoration. They spoke of the awe with which these first townsfolk regarded the beasts that still roamed the steppe beyond their fields. In a world where the aurochs, great cattle of terrifying strength, were still hunted, these horns were both relic and offering, reminders of the pact between humans and the wild. Death, too, lived in the house. The people of Çatalhöyük buried their dead beneath the platforms where they ate, worked, and slept. Bodies were wrapped and interred, sometimes painted with ochre, sometimes accompanied by small gifts. The bones of ancestors mingled with the foundations of family life. In some cases, skulls were later dug up, plastered with new faces, and returned to the household, as if the living could not bear to let the dead drift entirely into silence. The house itself became a lineage, a container of generations, a bridge between past and present. For nearly 15 centuries, the people of Çatalhöyük endured upon the Konya plain. They raised their children above the bones of their ancestors, plastered their walls again and again with red ochre, and climbed each morning onto the rooftops to begin another day in the great honeycomb of homes. Yet even the most enduring experiment has its limits. Around the 6th millennium before the Common Era, signs of strain began to appear, and over time, the settlement that had flourished so brightly dwindled, leaving only a silent mound upon the earth. The landscape that had once nurtured Çatalhöyük began to change. The marshlands and floodplains that had provided water and fertile silt slowly dried as regional climate shifted. Geological evidence suggests that the river which once ran near the site altered its course, leaving the inhabitants without the reliable flooding that had sustained their crops. Farming, which had once been difficult on this shifting land, now became easier in outlying regions where smaller groups could cultivate without the burden of dense communal living. The very forces that had drawn thousands together began to push them apart. Families seeking better soil and more space moved outward into the countryside, founding smaller villages beyond the crowded mound. Within the settlement, the traces of inequality began to creep into what had once been a remarkably egalitarian society. Archaeologists have uncovered houses larger than their neighbors, filled with finer goods and exotic materials that hint at privilege. Obsidian from distant sources, rare shells, and intricately crafted ornaments appear in some homes, while others contain little more than the necessities of survival. The pattern is subtle but telling. Over time, wealth and power may have gathered in the hands of a few households, upsetting the balance that had long kept Çatalhöyük together. The settlement itself grew increasingly difficult to maintain. With no streets to separate houses, every new building was raised upon the ruins of the old, pressing the mound higher into the sky. This process created a labyrinth of unstable foundations, where collapsed walls and buried debris had to be constantly managed. Fires, accidents, and disease would have spread easily in such tightly packed quarters, living cheek by jowl with thousands of others, sharing not only rooftops, but also the bones of generations buried beneath the floors, must have bred tension. The close communal life that had been Chatal, Huyuk's strength, may have become its greatest burden. Long before the first stones of Athens were laid, long before the pharaohs raised their pyramids upon the sands, another civilization emerged upon the floodplains of South Asia. Between the Indus and the Saraswati, in the lands that now stretch across Pakistan and northwestern India, a people came together whose achievements were as profound as they were mysterious. They flourished along the great rivers that spilled from the snows of the Himalayas, settling in fertile valleys where the waters spread in a wide, braided web across the plains. Here, sometime around 2600 before the Common Era, the Indus Valley civilization took form. The heart of this world was its geography. The Indus River and its tributaries brought not only water, but the silts that made the land rich. Summer monsoons swept in from the Indian Ocean, filling reservoirs and flooding the earth with life. Crops of wheat and barley thrived in the fields, alongside sesame and peas. Pastures supported cattle, sheep, and goats, while nearby marshes and riverbanks yielded fish, turtles, and wild fowl. The abundance of the land made settlement possible, but it was ingenuity that transformed villages into cities. By the middle of the third millennium, great urban centers had risen. Harappa in the north and Mohenjo-Daro further south along the Indus were the largest, but dozens of others dotted the plain, from Lothal near the Arabian Sea to Dolavira upon the island of Qadir. These were not haphazard towns, but carefully designed spaces. Streets were laid out in straight lines, crossing at right angles, forming a grid that spoke of deliberate planning. Houses of baked brick stood 2 or 3 stories tall, their walls strong against the rains. Some opened onto courtyards, others had staircases climbing to rooftops. From above, the cities of the Indus looked like ordered labyrinths, each quarter bound together by uniformity and care. What marked these settlements most of all was their attention to water. In Mohenjo-Daro, archaeologists have uncovered wells in nearly every household, lined with brick and carefully constructed. Drainage channels ran beneath the streets, carrying waste away from the homes, covered with fitted stone slabs. In some neighborhoods, public baths rose above the city blocks, the most famous being the Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, a tank lined with bitumen to keep it watertight, with steps descending from either end. It was a place not merely for cleansing but for ritual, a communal center where water carried spiritual as well as physical meaning. The people of the Indus Valley were not ruled by kings whose likenesses were carved upon monuments, nor by generals who left behind tales of conquest. No towering ziggurats or colossal statues dominate their ruins. Instead, their legacy lies in uniformity and order. Bricks were fired to the same proportions, from one end of the civilization to the other, suggesting a shared system and perhaps a shared authority that held without spectacle. Seals carved from steatite, inscribed with symbols that remain undeciphered, were pressed into clay and carried in trade, small emblems of identity and administration. The script upon them, hundreds of tiny signs, is one of the great mysteries of archaeology. This was a civilization of artisans and merchants. Beads of carnelian, agate, and faience have been found in great number, drilled with astonishing precision. Pottery was decorated with black designs of animals and plants, fired to a fine finish. The cities were not isolated but connected by roads and rivers, their goods carried as far as Mesopotamia, where Indus seals and beads have been uncovered in Sumerian cities. In return came silver, tin, and perhaps the stories of distant peoples. The docks at Lothal, with their great brick basin, suggest ships and sea trade, carrying the wealth of the Indus across the Arabian Sea. Though their names are lost to us, the people of the Indus Valley lived lives at once ordinary and profound. Children played with terracotta toys. Farmers tended their fields as the monsoon clouds rolled overhead. Women adorned themselves with bangles and beads. Men wore amulets and seals. In courtyards, meals of grain and lentils were prepared, and in workshops, beads and tools were shaped by skilled hands. Their world was one of quiet prosperity, built upon careful planning, abundant harvests, and a balance between humanity and the river's power. Here, upon the floodplains of the Indus, one of the world's first great urban civilizations took root, not in the shadow of kings, but in the careful order of streets and drains, in the rhythm of agriculture and trade. It was a society that found strength not in monuments of power, but in the fabric of daily life, woven across cities that endured for centuries. In the centuries after their first cities rose from the silt, the people of the Indus came into their full strength. Along the great river that bore their name, and across its fan of tributaries, a constellation of planned cities shone at once. At Harappa on the upper plain, at Mohenjo-Daro nearer the lower river, at Dholavira on an islanded salt flat, at Lothal near the tidal creeks of the Arabian Sea, and at Chanhudaro and Kalibangan and scores of smaller towns, the mature Harappan world took its settled form. From the air, it would have looked like order itself pressed upon the earth. Streets ran straight and true. Neighborhoods fitted together with a precision that spoke of surveyors and shared rules. Brickwork repeated the same measured proportions from one end of the realm to the other. The grid was not a symbol, it was a habit of mind. Mohenjo-Daro showed the pattern most clearly. The city rose upon elevated platforms of mud brick that kept floodwater at bay. A fortified citadel mound carried public buildings and storehouses and ritual structures. Below it, the lower town stretched in a chessboard of blocks. Brick houses stood 2 and sometimes 3 stories high, many with a cool central court and a stair rising to a flat roof where the evening breeze could be felt after the heat of day. The walls bore the familiar ratio that masons across the civilization favored, 1 to 2 to 4. Thousands upon thousands of identical bricks, fired in kilns that glowed with tamarisk and poplar, made the texture of Harappan life. In a land of monsoon and river flood, baked clay became permanence. Water was husbanded with a care that bordered on devotion. Wells punctuated the neighborhoods, circular shafts lined in brick that offered sweet water to each cluster of homes. In Mohenjo-Daro, there were hundreds of such wells, and almost every house was tied into a system of drains. Bathing platforms of brick and lime plaster sloped toward terracotta pipes. Wastewater ran out beneath the lanes in covered channels, passing through soak jars set into the pavement so that silt and grease would settle before the flow continued on. No city of the ancient world treated water and waste with such quiet competence. At the head of a broad stair on the citadel stood the great bath, its floor sealed with bitumen, its steps descending into green water that once reflected the light of lamps. It was not a mere pool. It was a civic heart where cleansing and ceremony met, a stone-bound answer to the river's eternal promise. Harappa, to the north, balanced functionality with scale. Along the citadel mound stood long brick platforms that later scholars called granaries for the way they were divided into orderly bays with air passages beneath. Nearby rose a hall with square brick pillars set in a regular grid that spoke of gatherings and administration. The lower town revealed the same relentless planning as Mohenjo-Daro, with wide thoroughfares and narrow lanes, with brick-lined drains and thresholds that turned aside street dust. At Dholavira, the Harappans adapted their ideals to harsher ground. There the city was partitioned into a citadel, a middle town, and a lower town, all defended by stout stone and brick walls. Great stepped reservoirs lay within and beyond the walls, linked by sluices and spillways, a whole landscape engineered to catch and store the gift of rare rains. In that island of salt and stone, the people of the Indus built a city around water as carefully as a jeweler builds a setting for a gem. The craft of the Harappans reached a refinement that left traces even in their smallest works. Beadmakers at Chandhu-Daro bored carnelian with drills tipped in hard stone and spun by bowstrings until the whole shone smooth and true. Etched carnelian took on delicate white designs after a careful treatment of mineral and heat. Shell workers along the coast carved bangles and inlays from conch brought in from warm seas. Potters turned vessels with elegant profiles and painted them with black slips in motifs of peacocks and pipal leaves and humped bulls. In many towns, faience workshops produced glimmering blue-green beads and amulets by fusing crushed quartz with alkali and copper compounds. Metalsmiths cast copper and bronze into blades and chisels and mirror discs, and sometimes into figurines small enough to sit in a palm, yet alive with motion. The famous little dancer, with her hand upon her hip and her hair drawn back into coils, speaks of a world confident in its own grace. All of this making rested on measurement. Across the realm, traders weighed their goods on cubical stones cut to standard values. The sequence stepped in regular increments, so that a buyer in Harappa could trust a seller from Lothal without argument. Bricks followed the same discipline, their dimensions tuned to a canon that allowed any wall to rise from any yard of bricks. The discipline extended to town plans and to the orientation of streets, which often ran to the cardinal points. This was a civilization that moved through rule and shared custom rather than proclamation. No monuments to kings dominate the skyline. No triumphal inscriptions tell of campaigns and captured prisoners. Authority hid itself in systems. It lived in brick dimensions and in the width of a lane, and in the seal, a merchant pressed into clay before his goods began their journey. That journey extended far beyond the river plain. The docks at Lothal enclosed a brick-lined basin connected to tidal water by a channel cut with care. Whether every scholar agrees on its exact use is less important than the truth it embodies. The Harappans built for the sea. Boats with high prows plied the Indus and its delta channels. Along coastal routes and across open water, they sailed to Oman and the Gulf. In Mesopotamia, scribes wrote of a distant land called Maluha, whose merchants came to their ports with beads and woods, and perhaps cotton textiles. Indus seals have been found in Sumerian cities. Cylinder seals from the west reached Harappan homes. Copper from the hills and tin from far mountains came into the Indus realm and left again transformed by skilled hands. Religion and rule left subtler marks. On white steatite, seals the engravers carved images that repeated across the centuries. A long-horned creature that scholars call the unicorn stands before a ritual stand. A bull lowers its head in power. A man sits cross-legged with heels together and arms on knees, surrounded by wild animals, a lord of beasts whom some see as an ancestor of later deities. Tiny clay figurines of women with elaborate headdresses appear in household shrines. Fire altars stood in courtyards at Kalibangan. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro suggests the importance of ritual purity and communal rite. Yet there are few weapons in graves and few signs of violent conquest. Whatever the Harappans believed, it did not demand colossal temples or boastful reliefs. Their piety rested in water and in the measured act repeated, in a seal pressed into soft clay, in a bath stepped into with clean feet. Daily life in this high age had a quiet rhythm that is almost audible still. In the early light, a woman drew water from a well set in the corner of her courtyard and poured it over a plastered floor that she had swept smooth. A potter lifted a vessel from a kiln and listened for the clear ring that meant the firing took well. Children chased one another along the edge of a lane and hopped over stone-set covers that hid a running drain. A scribe or merchant pressed his seal into a lump of clay on a jar lid, the tiny signs and sacred animal fixing ownership and destination. In the evening, men sat on the flat roofs and watched the last glow fade over the river while the breeze moved between the blocks of the city and cooled the brick. By every measure that matters in the life of a city, the Indus world had reached a rare balance. Its towns were clean and carefully serviced. Its craftsmen were expert, and its merchants trusted. Its farmers drew steady harvests from retentive soils and predictable floods. Its rulers, whoever they were, kept order without leaving grand claims in stone. The civilization learned to be strong by being regular and wide, rather than by being spectacular and narrow. In that quiet strength, it rivaled the great kingdoms to its west, and endured for centuries on the strength of rivers and rules. By the closing centuries of the third millennium, before the Common Era, the rhythm that had sustained the cities of the Indus began to falter. The signs show first as quiet changes in brick and street and storehouse. In Mohenjo-Daro, some lanes filled with silt and were never fully cleared. Drains that once carried wastewater under stone covers clogged and were patched with hurried work. Large rooms in houses were subdivided into smaller chambers. Kilns that had fired bricks to a uniform measure went cold in some quarters, and builders lifted old bricks from abandoned walls to reuse them elsewhere. In Harappa, the careful order of granary platforms and administrative halls gave way to a patchwork of new constructions raised with less precision. At Dholavira in the Rann of Kutch, the great reservoirs still held water, but the city on its island of salt and stone began to empty, its gateways quiet, its stepped tanks no longer busy with the footfall of thousands. The landscape itself was changing. The summer monsoon that for centuries had breathed life into the floodplains weakened by slow degrees. Lakes and riverbeds across the northwest record years of lower water and longer dry seasons. The Ghaggar-Hakra system that many identify with the ancient Saraswati dwindled as the Sutlej and the Yamuna shifted their allegiance toward other basins. Where broad channels had once run bank to bank with silty water, lesser streams wandered over gravel and sand. Farmers whose fathers had sown wheat and barley on flood-enriched fields faced erratic yields. Some seasons the river rose late or not at all. Other seasons violent water tore at bunds and washed seed from the soil. The delicate balance that had made urban life possible grew uncertain. Trade frayed at the edges. Far to the west, the cities of southern Mesopotamia suffered their own upheavals, and the old exchange of goods and seals and stories across sea and desert fell into interruption. References to Malua fade from scribal tablets. In the Indus towns, workshops still turned out fine goods, but the reach of their markets narrowed. The docks at Lothal silted. Boats still moved along the lower river and out to the creeks, yet fewer foreign tokens found their way back to Harappan homes. With less distant exchange to knit the realm together, each city and region turned inward to its own needs. Within the towns, the markers of a shared system loosened. Weights once cut to exact values show greater variation in the final centuries of city life. Seals of steatite become fewer. In some districts, the famous brick ratio that had given walls their reliable strength was abandoned for expedients that met the moment. The old regularity yielded to improvisation. None of this came in a single season. It unfolded across generations as builders chose repair over renewal, and as officials, whoever they were, could no longer sustain the labor and oversight that once kept streets clean and drains flowing. At Mohenjo-Daro, the river's power left its own signature. Archaeologists uncovered repeated layers of water laid silt across parts of the lower town. After each inundation, the citizens raised floor levels and thresholds to keep pace, but the struggle grew harder. In time, people abandoned the lowest quarters rather than lift them yet again. The Great Bath still held its stony dignity, but its galleries and stairways cracked, and the bitumen that once sealed its floor dried and pulled at the joints. In Harappa, cemeteries reveal a different kind of stress. Skeletons from later strata show more signs of disease and injury than those from earlier centuries. Tuberculosis and leprosy left marks on bone. Blunt force trauma appears in a small number of skulls. These are not the traces of a single day of conquest, but the toll of long hardship felt in bodies. As the rivers changed and the urban systems grew brittle, people moved. The pattern of occupation across the northwest tells of a slow outward drift from the great mounds towards smaller settlements spread more widely on the land. The Punjab and the upper Ganges basin drew many with the promise of more reliable summer rain. In the old heartland, urban life yielded to village life. The late Harappan cultures of Sindh and Punjab and Saurashtra kept much of the material inheritance of earlier centuries, while living at a gentler scale. Pottery shapes evolved and painted designs shifted. In Punjab, the cemetery culture that scholars label Cemetery H shows new mortuary customs and a taste for painted urns. In Sindh, the Jukar tradition carried forward elements of Harappan craft under reduced circumstances. Along the Saurashtra coast, the Sorath communities held on to a maritime life with fewer towns and more hamlets. The script that once marked seals and tablets fell out of use. Public works were no longer maintained to the standard that once astonished later ages. Yet, the people did not disappear. They planted and grazed and traded and raised children, now in hundreds of villages where once they had lived in dozens of cities. Older tales once spoke of invading hosts toppling the cities by violence. The ground tells a quieter and more complex story. There is little ash of conquest in Harappa or Mohenjo-Daro that matches a single fatal sack. Instead, there is flood and drought and river avulsion, a thinning of trade, a dispersal of people to where rains were better and fields more forgiving. Newcomers surely arrived over time, as newcomers always do along open plains, bringing languages and customs that met those of the old inhabitants. The end of the Indus cities was not a night of fire, but a long twilight in which households chose departure rather than struggle, or were compelled by hunger to seek new ground. Picture Mohenjo-Daro in its last inhabited generation. In the lower town, a lane runs between brick walls that once stood 2 stories tall. Some doorways are bricked up. A well at a corner still yields water, but its curb is worn, and the steps that drop to the bathing floor are uneven with patches. On a roof, a family cooks over a small hearth while the sun lowers over the river. They speak of a cousin who left for a farming village near the Doab where the monsoon is kinder. A beadmaker still drills carnelian in a workshop but sells more to neighbors and fewer to traveling traders. In the night, a warm wind moves through the empty rooms of a house across the lane, a house whose owners left seasons ago. In the morning, a cart creaks out of the lane piled with jars and bedding and a rolled mat, bound for a smaller settlement upriver. By about 1800 before the Common Era, the great cities were shadows of themselves. A century or two later, many of the mounds lay silent. Brick slipped and tumbled. Vines found roots in cracked mortar. Dust settled on thresholds that no longer felt the press of feet. The civilization that had mastered water and measurement and the quiet governance of streets had unraveled into a different way of life. Its gifts endured. Farming methods, craft skills, and the habit of ordered work passed to the communities that followed. Far to the east, centuries later, new towns would rise on the Ganges plain with their own forms and faiths. But if you look closely, you can see in them the long memory of measured brick and planned street learned beside the Indus. Crete lies like a long green ship in the middle sea, lashed by winter winds and blessed by long summers. Its spine a chain of mountains, whose snows feed springs that tumble down to plains of grain and groves that smell of resin and thyme. On this island between three continents, far enough from mainland strife to grow in its own manner, yet close enough to every coast, to gather ideas like shells from many shores, Europe's first great civilization took root. The earliest farmers were already here in the 7th millennium before the Common Era, tending emmer and barley and keeping sheep and goats on terraces cut into the hills. By the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, with copper tools in their hands and boats stout enough to follow the island chain of the Cyclades, the people of Crete began to weave together a culture that would rise into palaces and courtyards and storerooms deep with jars of oil and wine. Geography shaped everything. The broad Mazara plain in the south, open to warm winds off the Libyan Sea, yielded heavy harvests and favored the growth of olives and vines. The north coast offered anchorages like Amnisos that opened the way to the Aegean, while the east presented sheltered coves near Zakros that looked towards Cyprus and the Levant. Thick stands of cypress and pine gave strong timbers for ships and roofs. Mountain passes led to high sanctuaries where the people set small altars on windy peaks and watched the clouds move like caravans across the sky. The sea was not a barrier, but a road, and the Cretans learned its moods until hull and wave seemed to share a single pulse. By the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, a transformation was underway. Villages grew into large towns, and then into court-centered complexes that later ages would call palaces, though they were more than royal houses. At Knossos in the north, at Phaistos above the Masara plain, at Malea near a fertile coastal strip, and at Zakros in the east, builders laid out compounds around great paved courts. These places gathered grain, oil, wine, wool, timber, and crafted goods from the countryside and sent them out again across the island and over the sea. Long parallel magazines lined with stone bases held ranks of pithoi that could store the surplus of many harvests. Corridors turned and opened into light wells where sun and air fell down into inner rooms. Stairways climbed to upper stories where officials counted and recorded shipments with sealstones and clay nodules. On some tablets appears a native script that scholars call Cretan hieroglyphic, soon followed by another script known as Linear A. The language behind these signs remains unread, but the script itself tells us of an administration that needed writing to keep order in the flow of goods and obligations. The people of Crete did not ring these centers with massive walls. Their confidence rested in the sea and in the ships that patrolled the waters between islands, and perhaps in the ties of exchange that bound neighbors to them, roads of packed stone-linked palace and village. Near each center lay a town of workshops where potters fired thin-walled cups painted in lively bands of red and white on black, a style known by its fine place near the slopes of Mount Ida. Bronze workers hammered blades and chisels whose edges gleam still. Seal cutters turned soft stone into tiny masterpieces where lions prance and bulls lower their heads and spirals uncoil like waves. Household shrines held small figures of women with bright belts and flounced skirts who lift serpents in their hands, while horns set upon terraces and the sign of the double axe carved in stone mark a sacred imagery that repeats from one end of the island to the other. Religion breathed through mountaintop sanctuaries and caves deep in limestone hearts. On peaks like Yuktas, above Knossos and Petsofas in the east, worshippers left clay figurines of men with arms raised and women with long skirts, along with miniature vessels and models of animals, as if bringing the whole island in small to the place where sky and earth meet. In caves like Psychro on the slopes of Dicte, generations offered bronze blades and pins and plaques in dark chambers where water dripped and the air was cool, even in high summer. The sacred lived in high places and in the earth's deep places, and it lived also in the central courts where processions could unfold before many eyes, a ceremonial stage set by architects who understood light and wind. Trade bound Crete to every compass point. From the islands came fine emery for polishing and marble for vessels. From Cyprus and the Anatolian coast came copper by ingot and ore to feed the furnaces that turned a stony island into a bronze working power. From Egypt came faience and carved hippopotamus ivory and images of water birds and lotus that Minoan painters adapted to their own taste. From the Levant came cedar and blue glass and perhaps scribal practices. In return, the ships of Crete carried timber, oil, wine, woolen textiles, honey, and exquisite crafted goods that traveled with the seals that marked their origin. The iconography of Cretan art appears in far harbors, and Egyptian tomb paintings show people of the islands bringing gifts to the courts of pharaohs, their skin painted a reddish brown, their garments bright, their gifts heavy with scent. Within the island, wealth and skill concentrated in the court centers, but the countryside remained the foundation. Farmsteads dotted the plains and the lower slopes. Terraces stitched the hillsides to keep soil from running with the winter rains. Press rooms with grooved stone slabs and circular basins speak to the serious business of oil and wine production. Shepherds drove flocks along ancient tracks and brought wool to workshops, where spinners and weavers turned it into cloth, fine enough to glitter with tiny beads of faience. The rhythm of sowing and harvest continued without break, and with each season the magazines filled, the pithoi sealed with fresh clay, the seals pressed with symbols whose meanings are lost, but whose authority remains visible in the smooth oval of a seal print. Sometime in the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era, the island felt the earth shake with special fury. Archaeological layers at several sites show a horizon of destruction that ended the first generation of palaces. Walls cracked and fell, storerooms burned, yet the end of one phase became the beginning of another. In the generations that followed, the Cretans rebuilt on a larger plan. Courts grew broader, corridors more intricate, storerooms longer and more numerous. Light wells multiplied. Staircases carried traffic to higher floors where rooms opened to porticos with columns painted deep red and black. Fresco painters covered plaster with scenes of lilies and dolphins and people in ceremonial dress moving in ordered file. Administrative habits expanded with the spread of Linear A. The island entered a new energy that would carry it to its greatest reach. What emerges from this long rise is a picture of a society that learned how to gather and store surplus, how to manage movement of goods and people, how to dress ritual in an architecture of courts and terraces and light-filled rooms, and how to place itself at the center of sea roads that tied the Aegean to the shores of Egypt and the Levant. The Minoans became masters of an island by turning its mountains, plains, forests, and harbors into a single system with courts as its hearts. The strength of Crete in this age did not rest on walls but on knowledge of wind and current, on ships that knew every channel, on the measured flow of oil and grain and wine, and on the shared signs that sealed a jar or recorded a delivery. In this, the island fashioned a civilization whose grace and order astonish even now when only stones and fragments remain. By the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era, Crete stood at the center of the Aegean like a lordly ship with many oars, its harbors crowded with masts and its courts loud with the footfall of scribes and stewards. The palaces were the hearts that drove this island body. Knossos in the north unfurled around a great central court paved in white and buff slabs, with long rows of magazines where pithoi, as tall as a man, stood waiting for oil and grain and wine. Stairways of dressed gypsum rose beside light wells that dropped cool air into the building's inner rooms. Pier and door partitions opened whole suites so that sun and breeze could pass, and then close them again when ceremony demanded privacy. Water ran through terracotta conduits set beneath floors. At Knossos there were stone basins for bathing and even a lavatory with a seat worn by use, a small touch of luxury that speaks of a court used to comfort. Phaistos on the southern plain answered with its own terraces and a flight of steps that formed a gathering place like a small theater. Malia held magazines lined with stone bases where jars once stood in ranks. Zakros looked eastward across a rocky shore, its storerooms and reception halls fed by ships that came from Cyprus and the Levant. Around these centers spread towns of many storied houses with painted rooms and wells, and beyond them fields and terraces and olive groves that fed the magazines year by year. Administration gave rhythm to abundance. The island adopted writing for keeping accounts and sealing transactions. Clay nodules and tablets incised in Linear A recorded allocations of grain and oil and wool, the quantities marked by signs that recur from one end of Crete to the other. Ceilings carry images of lions and bulls and ships and sacred emblems pressed into damp clay to bind a jar or close a door. Weights of stone and bronze show a standard system, so that measure and reckoning held true whether one traded in the workshops near Knossos or at the harbor of Komos that served Phaistos. Villas in the countryside repeated the methods of the palaces on a smaller scale. They sat at road junctions and near press rooms with their own magazines and shrines, and acted as relay points for produce and as local seats of authority that tied village and field to palace court. The island was not a scatter of towns, but a network, its strands counted and sealed. Religion colored public life in ways that even the fallen plaster still reveals. On walls at Knossos blue dolphins swim above a room whose floors once shone with gypsum. In another chamber, a throne of carved stone sits against a wall painted with griffins that watch in stillness, while a basin lies set in the floor, where water would have reflected torchlight. On hilltops like Yuktas near Knossos and Petsofas above Palikastro, the wind still scours small platforms where worshippers left offerings of clay and bronze. In caves such as Psychro on Mount Dicta, votive blades and pins and figurines speak of centuries of devotion. In the central courts, the island staged processions and games that drew crowds to watch youths and maidens move with ritual grace. The bull was the most potent image, horns of consecration, crown walls, and terraces. Frescoes show acrobats gripping a charging bull by the horns and vaulting over the animal's back, a spectacle equal parts danger and display. An assertion that human skill could master raw force for a moment before letting it run free. Trade carried the fame of Crete far beyond its shores. Egyptian tomb paintings of the 18th dynasty show men from the islands bringing gifts to Thebes, labeled by scribes as people of Keftu. They carry silver vessels and painted cups and ingots, and strange objects whose beauty mattered more than their names. Minoan-style frescoes decorated halls at the delta site of Avaris, proof that Cretan painters or their students worked at foreign courts. To the north, islanders of Thera painted their town with lilies and swallows and ships until the sea breeze seemed to move along the walls. At Miletus on the Anatolian coast, and at Kythera south of the Peloponnese, Cretan crafts and habits took root. The ships of Crete were trim and long with high curling prows. They moved along the Cycladic chain and out across open water to Cyprus and to ports of Syria and Canaan. Timber, oil, wine, wool, honey, and saffron left the island. Copper, ivory, gold leaf, blue glass, and stones for seal cutting came in return. Maritime power in this age did not always announce itself with bronze rams and rows of captured shields. Sometimes it is better measured in safe harbors kept orderly, in customs duties collected without quarrel, and in the ability of a convoy to arrive in season year after year. Politics on Crete did not carve itself on steles with long proclamations, yet it left clear traces in building and in reach. Knossos appears to have eclipsed its rivals during the later part of the Neo-Palatial era. The scale of its magazines and the spread of its ceilings point to a centralization stronger than before. Country villas aligned with Gnossian interests dot the central and eastern landscape. Road systems converge on the capital. The absence of great fortifications at palaces suggests that control was exercised through fleets and through the web of exchange and obligation rather than through garrisons behind walls. Even so, power never goes uncontested for long. On the mainland to the north, the Mycenaean princes grew rich behind the Cyclopean walls of Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos. Their grave circles yielded daggers inlaid with gold and silver images of lion hunts and sea battles. Their scribes would later write an early form of Greek on clay tablets in Linear B. These lords traded with Crete and learned from it, but they also coveted and competed. In Aegean politics, a friend today could be a rival tomorrow when a storm or an earthquake or an empty grain store overturned the balance of favor. War and diplomacy left faint but telling signs in the island record. The harbour town of Kydonia on Crete's northwestern coast shows evidence of contact with the mainland that would later become domination. At Knossos, after the middle of the 15th century, before the Common Era, the administrative tablets are no longer in Linear A, but in Linear B, which speaks of Greek speech and Mycenaean control. Before that turning, in the bright height of Minoan confidence, Cretan craftsmen and officials likely managed a league of allied towns and outposts, each bound to court centers by roads, shrines, and accounting. Enemies beyond the sea knew the cost of challenging such a system. Pirates might try a raid on a soft shore, but the island's fleets and watchful harbors answered. When diplomacy suited better than force, gifts and marriages and mutual trade concessions kept the sea lanes smooth. Crete held its position through a mixture of abundance, agility, and the prestige of a culture that others wished to share. The arts reached a fineness that still startles. In the century before the fall, the potters perfected what scholars call the marine style. Octopuses stretched their tentacles across rounded jars, their eyes bright, their bodies wrapped around the curve of clay as if clinging to the very sea. Argonauts and dolphins and seagrass flow across cups and craters with a confidence that could only come from people who lived by tides and current. Jewelers at Malea created a gold pendant in the form of two bees clasping a drop of honey, a piece so delicate that every leg and wing preserves a sense of life. Sword makers set hilts with rock crystal and carnelian. Seal cutters carved stones so small that they disappear in the palm, yet when pressed in clay they show hunters and altars and ships with a clarity that rivals later gem carving. The courts of Crete were not only storehouses, they were schools of taste that set fashions from the Nile to the Anatolian shore. Daily life under this high order was practical and layered with ceremony. In the towns around the palaces, houses rose in blocks of ashlar and rubble, their ground floors used for storage and craft, their upper rooms for living and receiving. Wells stood in courtyards. Streets were paved where traffic was heavy. Workshops for pottery and bronze lay in their own quarters, so that smoke and hammering did not disturb the processions that crossed the west courts. Farmers on the Messara ploughed small fields behind oxen and hauled baskets of olives to presses where stone basins wait still. Shepherds moved flocks along marked paths and brought fleeces to fullers and spinners. When news came that a fleet had reached harbour, officials opened storerooms and measured out cargoes while scribes marked tablets and stamped them with cylinder seals. On festival days, the palace courts filled with colour and sound. Musicians beat frame drums and blew on reed pipes. Dancers in flounced skirts and belts moved in figures before the raised stands, while elders and guests watched from steps that flanked the courts like small theatres. Thus looked the power of Crete when fortune favoured it. A chain of palace centres, linked by roads and shrines, a countryside worked to steady yield, a set of scripts and measures that kept accounts clear, a religion that bound communities through shared rites and emblems, a fleet that made the island master of sea roads rather than a prisoner of them, and a diplomacy that stretched from Egypt to the Levant and the Anatolian coast. Its enemies were distance and earthquake and the rising ambition of neighbours. Its allies were order and skill and the sea that bore its ships outward and brought wealth home again. The island that had trusted to ships and surplus learned that the earth and sea could be enemies as well as roads. Crete lies along a rim of fire where the Hellenic arc grinds and heaves, and more than once the palaces felt that power. The first great court centres ended their early life in a horizon of fallen walls around 1700 before the Common Era, an earthquake season that cracked magazines and toppled stair towers. The people rebuilt with grander plans and deeper storerooms, proof of resilience rather than weakness, yet the lesson stood. Stone alone cannot bind fortune. North of Crete, a volcano rose from the water like a sleeping beast. When it woke, the world changed. On Thera, the town at Akrotiri was sealed under ash and pumice that fell in drifts as deep as a house, preserving streets and frescoes and jars as if a curtain had dropped in a single hour. Tree rings from far mountains and ice cores from northern ice fields mark the years around 1600 before the Common Era as a time of great eruption, though scholars still argue over the exact year. What matters for Crete is not only ash, but water. Along the north and east coasts of the island, at places like Palaiktro and Amnisos, sediments show marine sand and smashed pottery and splintered wood thrown inland, a signature of waves that raced south after the mountain tore itself open. Coastal works were wrecked, shoreline farms salted, harbours choked with pumice that floated for months on the Aegean. Ashfall on Crete itself was uneven and not deep, but the blow to shipping and to coastal settlements was real. For a society whose lifeblood moved by sea, disrupted harbours and dead fish could starve accounts as surely as an enemy fleet at anchor. Yet the island did not fall at once. In the years after the eruption, the courts still filled with processions. Painters still laid lilies and dolphins on wet plaster. Seal cutters still pressed their sacred emblems into clay. The palaces that had been rebuilt after the earlier earthquake season continued to rule their networks through magazines and villas and shrines. But beyond the horizon, the mainland princes gathered strength. In the Argolid and Messenia, behind walls of massive stone, Mycenaean lords counted their own storehouses and sent their ships along the same sea roads. They learned Cretan forms, then pushed their own. On Thera, the island art that had looked to Knossos ceased and did not resume. On the Nile Delta, the wall paintings done in Cretan manner came to an end. The balance that had favored Crete began to tilt. Then came fire in many places at once. Across the island, in what scholars call the late Minoan IB period, sanctuaries went dark, magazines burned, towns were sacked. Pallaicastro in the east shows layers of collapse and char and smashed cult images. Zakros, at the far end of the island, was destroyed and abandoned. Mochlos and Gornia, and country villas across central and eastern Crete show the same bitter signs. This was not the work of a single earthquake or of a stray blaze in a crowded quarter. Cult rooms are singled out for smashing. Palatial buildings are targeted. The pattern of destruction is too selective and too widespread to be accident. Whether by invasion, by internal revolt, or by both, power changed hands on Crete. Knossos alone escaped that particular firestorm. In the quiet that followed, the administration there changed its tongue. The clay tablets from its storerooms shift from Linear A to Linear B, and the language behind the signs is Greek. The tablets list rations for workers and herds, inventories of perfumed oil, records of chariot fittings and bronze allotments, all in the style of mainland archives. Burial customs change as well. Chamber tombs appear in numbers near Armenoi, filled with swords, bronze bowls, and the teeth of boar tusk helmets, gear of warriors of the mainland style. Pottery fashions turn toward motifs and shapes that first appear in Mycenaean halls. At Charnia on the western coast, which the ancients knew as Kydonia, a Mycenaean administrative complex rises, and the town grows in rank as a center of power that answers no longer to Knossos. The old Cretan order has been replaced by a new regime that values the island for its resources, its strategic harbors, and the prestige of its palaces, now repurposed for a different court. The political map that follows is one of Mycenaean strongholds on Cretan soil. Knossos administers much of central and eastern Crete for a time, as the Linear B tablets show with lists of districts and deliveries. Kydonia rises as a western capital with its own mainland links. The countryside is reorganized to feed these new courts. Villas that once served as Cretan relay stations are rebuilt or abandoned. Some sanctuaries are restored in modest form, but many old cult practices fade, and new rites tied to mainland customs take their place. The fleets that tie Crete to Cyprus and to the Levant still sail, yet the tone of exchange has shifted. Mainland palaces now dominate the Aegean sea roads, and Cretan craft serves their fashions. Even this second life did not endure. Around the 14th century before the Common Era, Knossos itself went up in flames, its archives baked hard in the heat that destroyed the rooms where they lay. The palace never returned to its earlier reach. Power fragmented into regional centers, with western Crete at Kydonia remaining a seat of strength, while eastern towns shrank or turned inward. Population thinned in highland districts. Workshops simplified their output. Fresco programs grew rare and small. The island that had once set the rhythm for the Aegean now followed the lead of others, and then began to drop out of the orchestra entirely. The last act came when the whole eastern Mediterranean trembled. In the years around 1200 before the Common Era, palaces fell from Anatolia to the Peloponnese. Trade routes broke, populations moved, and fortresses burned from coast to coast. Crete shared that fate. Mycenaean centers on the island were abandoned or reduced to small hilltop communities that looked to their own survival rather than to distant markets. Iron appears in small amounts. Pottery styles lose the exuberant marine life of earlier centuries and settle into simpler forms. The old scripts vanish from use. In later tradition, Greek storytellers would speak of Dorians coming down into the islands, but the archaeology shows a drawn-out contraction rather than a single conquering rush. By the dawn of the first millennium before the Common Era, the island had entered a leaner age of villages and sanctuaries on peaks, far removed from the courts where Pythoi once stood row on row. What political lesson lies in this unmaking is as plain as any carved in stone. The Minoan system could survive earthquake and even the ash of a volcano, for it rebuilt from within. It could not survive a coordinated assault on its sacred and administrative hearts at many sites, nor the arrival of neighbors who controlled the same seas and could redirect the flows of goods and power. Enemies were not only waves and shaking earth, but ambitious princes across the water who turned admiration into occupation. The palatial world of Crete that once dazzled visitors with painted dolphins and bull games and magazines deep with harvests ended as so many empires do. Not in one day, but in a series of ruinous seasons that stripped away confidence and left people to choose smaller lives in safer places. The ruins remained. At Knossos, a throne of stone sits still in a room watched by painted griffins, the basin dry, the plaster cracked. At Pallaicastro, a shattered cult statue lay where fire and force broke it, the ivory limbs and gold leaf scattered across a floor of blackened debris. At Zakros, the storerooms that once smelled of oil and wool hold only dust. Later generations would remember a king named Minos and a maze and a monster, a myth made from the memory of a power that once ruled with fleets rather than with walls. The real story is written in ash, in clay tablets that changed language, in wave-laid sands on northern shores, and in the sudden silence of courts that had guided an island for centuries. Across the high spine of central Anatolia, the land rises in a great wind-combed plateau cut by cold rivers and ringed by dark mountains. Winters are iron, and summers burn under a hard sky. Oaks cling to the hillsides, and steppe grass runs to the horizon. At the great bend of the Kizillimak River, there is a limestone hill with gullies and ledges where eagles wheel and jackals cry at dusk. Here the Hittites set their capital and called it Hattusa. From this fortress of stone and timber, they reached out to gather scattered towns into a kingdom that would one day stand among the powers of the late Bronze Age. Before the Hittites came, others had named and worked these valleys. The Hattians spoke their own tongue and venerated their own gods in shrines of wood and clay. To the south and east, Assyrian merchants from the city of Ashur opened trading stations in the 19th and 18th centuries before the Common Era, most famously at Kanesh, near modern Kultepe. They brought tin for bronze and fine textiles, and kept careful accounts on clay tablets. Thousands of those tablets have been found in the ruins of their warehouses, and through them we watch local Anatolian lords bargain for metal and pledges, while caravans creak along the winter roads. Out of this marketplace of languages and gods, there rose a people who spoke an early Indo-European tongue and learned to write it with borrowed signs. The Hittites took the cuneiform of the Assyrians and bent it to their own speech, and with that act they fixed their voice more firmly in the earth than any city wall. Their earliest history comes to us in shards. A king named Anita of Kusara tells how he sacked Hattusa and laid a curse on anyone who tried to rebuild it. Yet, A century later, a ruler who took the name Hattusili defied the curse and made the hill his own seat. From Hattusa, he marched against the cities of the north and the west and the south, tightening the ring around his capital with each campaign. He left an edict for his descendants that survives in clay, recounting how he bound nobles to oath and set his grandson as heir above older rivals. In those lines, we hear a kingdom being hammered into shape, not only by the sword, but by law and ceremony. After Hattusili came Mursili, who drove his army over mountain passes and across the Euphrates, took Aleppo, and pushed on to Babylon. His sack of that old city, around 1595, before the Common Era, ended a dynasty and startled the Near East. It was a feat as audacious as it was distant from home, and it shows a state already confident in its strength, yet the triumph was followed by palace intrigue and murder, reminders that power in Hattusa was still a quarrelsome thing. The ground that carried these kings to war also taught them caution. North of Hattusa, the Pontic Mountains shelter the Kaska, highland tribes who moved like wolves across the ridges to burn fields and carry off herds. To the west lay the lands of Arzawa with their own princes and Luwian speech. To the south, the old Hurrian realm of Aleppo guarded the road to Syria, and farther east, the Hurrians gathered into the rising state we call Mitanni, famed for chariotry and horse training. The Hittite heartland sits between these rivals and raiders, exposed on three sides, anchored only by its hard hills and its stubborn towns. It is little wonder that Hattusa grew into a fortress city with terraces cut from rock, casemate walls running for leagues, ramps and towers, and gates guarded by carved lions and sphinxes. The great earthen rampart at Urkapi carries a wall like a crown, and beneath it a postern tunnel pierces the bank so that men could pass unseen in a siege. Water channels and cisterns sank into the hill so that the city could drink even when fields burned. No single work tells you more about Hittite temperament than those stone defenses built not to dazzle but to endure. In the lower city stood the great temple dedicated to the storm god of Hatti and the sun goddess of Arinna. Its storerooms held pithoi and bins, its courts bore the marks of ritual processions, and its thresholds were worn by the feet of priests and petitioners. Above, in the upper city, dozens of smaller sanctuaries served a pantheon so generous that later scribes called their land the realm of 1,000 gods. They did not scorn foreign deities, but adopted them with their rites and names. When the Hittites conquered a town, they often took its god into their own lists and built it a house in Hattusa. The royal family guarded this abundance of cults through a sacred office that outlasted kings. The queen bore the title Tawananna, and that title clung to the person of the queen for life, so that a new king might rule beside his mother as sovereign priestess before his own consort ascended. In this mixture of piety and policy, we see a court that understood how ceremony steadies a throne. Their laws give another window into the house they were building. The Hittite law code survives in copies that show corrections and additions across generations. It is notably sparing with death. Where Babylon often punished with the sword, Hattusa preferred compensation in silver or service. Fines scaled by status and circumstance fill the tablets. A thief owes more if he steals from a temple store. A man who injures another can settle matters by agreed payment rather than by blood. There are harsh lines too, but the impression is of a state that treats law as a tool to reconcile neighbors and to keep farmers in their fields and smiths at their forges. This preference for order over spectacle is the same spirit that laid out granaries within the city walls and kept clay archives in wooden chests. The craft of writing became the backbone of government. Hattusa's scribes kept tablets in Hittite for domestic business and in Akkadian for foreign letters. They copied myths and rituals from the Hattians and the Hurrians, recorded festivals that moved with the seasons, and archived treaties with vassals and rivals. Out among the rocks, 2 leagues from the city, lies Yazilikaya, a sanctuary cut into limestone where reliefs of gods in file stride along the walls. There the storm god meets the mother goddess on the main panel, while lesser deities pass with their names carved above them. The place likely served as a house of the New Year festival when the king visited the gods before leading the land into another cycle of sowing and war. It is both a book and a chapel made of stone. Hittite armies marched from these rituals into harsh work. The plateau favors horses, and the Hittites became masters of the chariot. At first, a team pulled a 2-man car. Later, a 3-man crew added a shield bearer to protect the driver and archer. Their state drew on vassal contingents from a wide ring of allied or subdued cities, so that when a king called, men and carts came in from Aleppo, from Carchemish on the Euphrates, from the towns of western Anatolia, each bound by oath and by the fear of royal anger. Campaigns left their trace in the royal annals. The north is a litany of raids and reprisals against the Kaska, who were never finally beaten. The west tells of struggles with Arzawa. The south opens onto Syria, where trade routes and rich cities beckoned. It is in these struggles that the Hittites learned diplomacy as carefully as war, for every advance risked a new front, and every victory required a treaty to hold it. What did their cities look like as this kingdom took shape? Hattusa sprawled across broken terrain, a maze of wards and terraces, with the palace district set high so that the king could look over storehouses and stables and watch smoke rise from hundreds of hearths. The wall is built in sections with stone foundations and mud brick above, studded with towers that command steep slopes and blind turns. At the Lion Gate, 2 great beasts carved from single blocks watch over a passage still worn where wheels and sandals passed. At the King's Gate, a warrior figure stands with horned headdress and sword to guard the approach. Inside the great temple, 2 courtyards lead to inner rooms where offerings were made, and galleries of storerooms hold the remains of grain and oil that kept the city when winter closed mountain passes. Roads paved in stone lead out to satellite towns and to the sacred spring at Eflaton Pinar, where a monumental relief of deities later watched water slide over ashlar blocks. Even the countryside bears their touch in rock reliefs where kings present offerings to gods upon cliff faces so that the land itself becomes a witness and a contract. When we speak of their rise, we must mention the one feat that announced them to distant peoples. After taking Aleppo, Mursili led his troops along the Euphrates into Mesopotamia and sacked Babylon. He did not try to rule there. He withdrew as quickly as he had come, perhaps carrying riches and captives, and certainly leaving a power vacuum that others rushed to fill. The gesture was both a blow and a message. It told the world that a new force sat in the Anatolian highlands and that its reach was longer than many had guessed. At home, the blow echoed in palace murder and usurpation, reminders that Hattusa was still teaching itself how to pass a crown from hand to hand without cutting the palm that held it. By the end of this first period, the Hittite state had forged the tools of its later greatness. A capital set like a strong tooth in the jaw of the plateau, a pantheon large enough to absorb gods of every town and tribe, a law that favored settlement and compensation, an archive that remembered promises and curses, a chariot arm that could move fast over bad ground, a diplomacy that learned to bind vassals with oaths sealed before gods who punish oath breakers. Against them stood hungry neighbors, mountain raiders, and princes across the sea who watched the same trade routes. Between those weights, the House of Hatti found its balance and began to call itself a great kingdom. In the 13th and late 14th centuries before the Common Era, the House of Hatti stood shoulder to shoulder with the greatest realms of its age. From Hattusa, on the cold plateau, the kings of the Hittites stretched command south to the warm lands of Syria, west to the Aegean shore, and east to the bend of the Euphrates. The empire did not look like a single block of color on a tidy map. It was a web of stone cities and loyal or fearful vassal states strung along roads and rivers. At the center sat Hattusa with its terraced walls and crowded archives. Beyond the central hills rose provincial capitals that were kingdoms in their own right under Hittite princes. Carchemish guarded the crossings of the Euphrates and watched the caravan routes to Mesopotamia. Aleppo commanded the north gate into Syria. Farther south, coastal Ugarit spoke many tongues in its markets and paid its tribute by ship and overland caravan alike. Each of these hubs anchored a ring of lesser towns that sent grain and soldiers when the great king called. The empire took shape under Suppiluliuma, who rebuilt Hittite fortunes with iron will and careful treaty-making. He smashed the old Hurrian confederacy of Mitanni, married into dynasties, and set his sons as viceroys over the conquered Syrian lands, so that royal blood stood at every hinge of the southern frontier. His name traveled so far that when a young pharaoh died in Egypt without an heir, the widowed queen sent a desperate letter to Hattusa asking for a Hittite prince to marry and take the throne. Suppiluliuma sent his son north through unfriendly ground, only for the prince to be killed before he reached the Nile. The episode poisoned relations with Egypt for a generation and set the stage for wars along the Orontes River, where Hittite and Egyptian armies stalked one another among fortified towns. Hattusa in these years was a capital in full stride. The lower city centered on the great temple to the storm god of Hatti and the sun goddess of Arina, its twin courtyards paved and swept, its storerooms laid out in long ranges where jars could be tallied by scribes with reed pens. The upper city rose behind miles of wall that climbed the spine of the hill and ran along the crest of Yerkapi, where a stone-faced ramp carried the wall like a causeway into the sky. Gates flanked by lions and sphinxes admitted processions on holy days and armies on campaign days. In palaces of timber and stone, the court received envoys who brought letters on clay from pharaohs and kings. Akkadian served for diplomacy, the international speech of that world, while Hittite clay kept domestic accounts. Tablets recorded treaties, law codes, ration lists, land grants, and oaths that summoned the wrath of gods on any man who broke his word. When fire came in later ages, it baked these tablets hard, and so accident made an immortal library of the Hittite state. Power in Hatti was never only fortification and fear, it was also administration and ritual. The kings bound their vassals by treaties that were works of art in obligation. They named the parties, recited the history of favor and rebellion, set exact terms for tribute and military aid, and called on a roll of gods to witness the signatures. They listed curses for breaking faith that chilled the blood. The treaties reached from the Luwian-speaking lands of western Anatolia to Wilusa on the northwestern fringe which many have identified with Troy, and south across Syria where cities like Katna and Ugarit swore fealty. A treaty with a prince named Alexandu of Wilusa shows Hittite kingship projecting law across the sea roads, while tablets from Ugari balance accounts in silver for timber and copper and purple-dyed cloth. The law at the center created order at the edges. War made that law credible. The Hittite army moved with a corps of heavy chariots drawn by swift horses and with ranks of infantry from the heartland and from vassal contingents. Horse training was a science. An old manual attributed to a master trainer who served Mitanni but was copied in Hattusa gives a program of conditioning that speaks of measured trotting, intervals, watering times, and rest days. It is a rare voice of craft from an age of kings. In battle, the Hittites often used a three-man chariot crew, driver and archer and shieldman, a platform for shock and for archery that could break enemy lines if properly supported. Supply moved along royal roads that crossed the plateau in long stages marked by wells and posting stations. In winter, armies went home. In spring, the king made sacrifice at Yazilikaya, where processions of carved gods stride along limestone walls, and then he called the land to arms again. The clash with Egypt defined the pride of the age. When Muwatalli sat on the throne in Hattusa and Ramses, the second wore the crowns of the two lands. Both men looked to the same strip of cities in the Orontes Valley. Kadesh stood like a nail in that plank. Ramses marched north with 4 divisions and surprised a Hittite chariot force, then found himself ambushed by the main Hittite army which crashed through his camp in a storm of dust and arrows. The day seesawed. Egyptian accounts on temple walls in Thebes claim a god led the pharaoh back into the fight and saved the host. Hittite records speak more coolly of a stout defense and a siege abandoned because neither side could finish the other with fresh troops in reach. What matters most is what followed. Perfect victory could not be had, so diplomacy took its place. A generation later, Hattusili III and Ramses II concluded a formal peace that survives in both kingdoms' copies. It pledged mutual defense, the extradition of fugitives, and oaths before a great roll of gods. To seal the friendship, an Egyptian royal wedding joined Ramses to a Hittite princess in a ceremony recorded amid the pomp of Thebes. It is the earliest surviving international treaty of its kind, and it speaks to the Hittite conviction that law and oath could do what spears alone could not. The empire's enemies did not stand only in the south. To the north, the Kaska clans descended from the Pontic forests to burn fields and trouble the edges of Hattusa year after year. They were poor in cities and rich in stubbornness. Their raids were part of every king's annals, like a season of bad weather. To the west, the lands of Arzawa and the shadowy power that Hittite texts call Ahiyawa, which many link to the Mycenaean world, pushed and pulled the frontier. Sometimes a prince in western Anatolia accepted a Hittite treaty and sent hostages to guarantee good behavior. Sometimes he appealed to Ahiyawa and brought in swords from across the sea. Kings in Hattusa wrote sharp letters to foreign lords demanding the return of runaways and the punishment of rebels who claimed foreign protection. The West was a chessboard where diplomacy, marriage, and sudden marches of troops tried to keep a lid on a pot that always wanted to boil. Within the empire, rulers experimented with ways to steady what they had won. Muwatalli shifted the royal seat south to a new city called Tarhuntassa to be closer to the Syrian front and perhaps to ease the burden of the northern Kaska threat. After him, Hattusili restored Hattusa as capital, but kept family members as viceroys in Carchemish and Aleppo, so that royal authority in the south wore a face that subjects could respect. Tudhaliya IV undertook public works to nurse the heartland through dry years. He repaired dams and reservoirs and reorganized the state cults so that gods received due offerings in the proper season. In this kingship, we see a conscious effort to manage climate and faith with the same deliberate hand used to shape law and battle order. The look and feel of Hittite power showed in their cities. Carchemish was a city of merchants and garrisons, a place where envoys from Babylon and Assyria met with princes descended from Hattusa's line. Ugarit on the coast shone with bilingual tablets in Ugaritic alphabet and in cuneiform, with merchant houses stacked with ingots and amphorae, with shipyards that could send a message by sail faster than any road. In these places, Hittite overseers balanced books and collected tribute, but also allowed local kings to display their own gods and dynastic pride, so long as the oaths held and the road to Hattusa remained open. It was a federated empire managed by paper and oath as much as by sword. In the court, the presence of queens steadied dynastic change. The title Tawananna clung to the queen for life, and documents show strong royal women who administered estates, oversaw cults, and corresponded with foreign courts. When a new king took the throne, his consort waited for the passing of the elder queen before she took the sacred office, and that delay could shape faction and policy. The royal family spread its branches across the empire through viceroyalties and governorships, a web of kinship that increased loyalty, yet also multiplied rivalries that had to be managed with care. Culture at the height of Hittite power carried a composite face. In the sanctuaries, gods bore Hattian, Hurrian, and Luwian names side by side. In the archives, Hittite myths sit with Hurrian hymns. Scribes sent letters to Egypt in Akkadian formulas, while recording local disputes in their own tongue. The empire fed on metals from Taurus mines, on Syrian timber, on grain from Anatolian plains, on horses raised under northern skies. It minted little coin because its wealth moved in kind, yet its accounts are precise. When we picture a royal audience at Hattusa in this age, we should imagine a hall hung with colored textiles, with bronze vessels bright as mirrors, with envoys of many lands, and with a king who knew as much about the clauses of a treaty and the training of a horse as he did about omens drawn from the flight of birds. There is a last measure of this height. When foreign kings wrote to Hattusa, they addressed the great king as brother. The Amarna letters from an earlier generation show the habit begun, and the later treaty texts make it permanent. Between Egypt and Hatti, the word brother meant equal, a peer under heaven with whom one could exchange gifts of gold and lapis and brides without loss of face. No phrase better captures how far the Hittites had come from the days when their kings fought over who would hold the hill of Hattusa. They had climbed to a place where their word could bind princes from the Aegean to the Euphrates, and where their chariots could make that word good. The empire of Hatti entered its last century with the look of strength still upon it. From the terraces of Hattusa, the walls ran like grey rivers over the ridges. The archives were thick with tablets. The viceroys in Carchemish and Aleppo still rode out with processions of gods before them. Yet beneath the stone the seams had begun to split. The Heartland Plateau is a hard country that depends on winter snow and spring rain, and the climate turned against it. Tree rings from old Anatolian junipers speak of narrow growth and failed seasons, and in the reckoning of later scholars, a grim sequence appears near the end of the 13th century before the Common Era, when 3 dry years followed one upon another. On such a plateau, 1 failed harvest can be endured, and 2 will empty granaries. A 3rd strips the bark from the state itself. Hittite letters from the last rains beg for grain from the south. The king writes to Ugarit and to other ports asking that ships be loaded with barley and sent north without delay. When the capital must import bread by sea, security has already thinned to a paper skin. Hunger does not come alone. The same drought that pinched the plateau also drove peoples from hills and forests. To the north, the Kaska pressed closer, slipping through the Pontic ravines to burn outlying villages and carry off herds while the field armies were away. To the west, the lands of Arzawa and the princes who looked across the water to Ahiawa tested the frontier. To the south, the cities of Syria that once paid tribute with measured silver faced their own storms. Ugarit's last tablets tell of enemy ships off the coast and of messengers who could not ride the roads because the land was full of foes. The king of that city wrote in panic to a neighbor and received a reply as bleak as winter, for the neighbor could send no help because his own fields were on fire. In Egypt, a generation later, the scribes would carve on the walls of Medinet Habu how sea peoples came with their families in ox carts and with their fleets in line, and how all the lands to the north fell in ruin. The Hittites did not leave such boastful carvings. but the pattern lines up like beads. The last kings of Hatti fought to steady the house while the timbers groaned. Suppiluliuma II, who bears the name of a great ancestor, led campaigns to the south coast and boasted of victories over Alashia, which is the island of copper men called Cyprus. Inscriptions speak of battles at sea, a rare note for a land power, as if even the kings of the plateau had been forced to learn the war of waves to keep grain ships moving and to cut the roads of raiders. Inland, royal hands tried to stitch up old rips. Tudhaliya, the fourth before him, had rebuilt dams and reservoirs and rewoven the great festivals so that the gods received their due and the land might return to balance. Hattusili had written peace with Egypt to bind the southern front, yet every cure came too late or held only for a season. When the climate robs the fields and when neighbors feel the weakness in the pulse of a state, policy must fight the sky as well as the sword. Few kingdoms can manage both at once for long. The political map within the empire showed cracks of its own. Earlier in the century, Muwatalli had moved the royal seat to Tarhuntassa in the south, to be nearer to Syria and farther from the Kaska, and after him, a relative named Kurunta claimed that city and its realm, leaving a scar of rivalry that later kings could not quite close. Western Anatolia held princes who smiled in Hittite courts and wrote obedient letters, then turned to seek favor from Ahiawa when the wind shifted. Vassal kings in Syria counted on Hittite garrisons to keep enemies at bay, but when the grain carts failed and the chariot teams grew thin, garrisons melted away, and the oaths in the treaty tablets felt like old songs sung to empty seats. In such hours, even faithful clients hedge their bets. A federated empire that lives by treaty and shared worship can stretch wide when roads are safe and harvests fat. When roads fill with refugees and the storehouses echo, the cords loosen fast. The ruin left marks that the ground still holds. Hattusa's upper city shows blackened debris where the great temple quarter once kept its pithwai and its bins. Gate passages are choked with tumbled brick and ash-fired clay. The postern tunnel under the Yerkapi rampart still breathes cool air, but above it the crown of wall collapsed and was never raised again. There is no clear layer of mass slaughter, no single storm of bodies piled in streets, which tells its own tale. The city was evacuated or bled dry before the final fires. The Kaska, who had long haunted the northern marches, likely walked the empty courts and stripped carved lintels for their huts. The old capital fell silent and stayed so for centuries. Unlike some cities that are rebuilt again and again on their own bones, Hattusa did not rise a second time in that age. That quiet is one of the starkest facts of the end. Farther south, the fall took a different form. Carchemish on the Euphrates endured. There the line of Hittite viceroys and princes weathered the storm, cut loose from the high plateau and its burning fields, and built new houses on the river trade. From these roots grew the patchwork of states we call Neo-Hittite, city kingdoms with Luwian speech written in hieroglyphic signs on stone. Melid in the Malatya plain, Kumu on the upper Euphrates, Gurgum in the hills of Karamanmaras, Patin near the Orontes, Samal at Zincirli, and Quay on the Cilician plain. Each carved local realms with walls and steles that show kings standing before gods, while Assyrian and Aramean neighbors pressed around them. The great cuneiform of Hattusa fell silent, but the old gods walked on under new names, and bull-horned altars still smoked. These were heirs by blood and custom, not by power, and in time, Assyria folded them into its own iron order. Their survival shows that Hittite strength did not vanish in one breath. It retreated to river and hill and changed its voice. The reasons for the end gather like storm clouds from many directions. Climate stress stripped the heartland of surplus and forced the capital to beg for grain by sea. Trade networks that fed bronze with tin and copper snapped in many places so that smiths had no steady supply of metal and chariot workshops lacked fittings and nails. Raiders from sea and forest turned roads into traps so that letters arrived late if they arrived at all. Internal politics offered no unbroken hand to steer with. Famine fed unrest in villages, and soldiers loyal to pay and rations began to drift home to guard their own kin. When a federated empire that holds 1,000 towns by oath and custom cannot deliver food, protection, and ritual in season, the oaths unravel and the custom turns to memory. There is one more older wound that may have weakened the body. In the reign of Suppiluliuma, the first, long before the final century, plague came into the land after soldiers returned from campaigns in the south. Royal prayers from that time ask why the pest does not lift and whether a broken oath has angered the gods. For years, the court lost officials and kin to fever. Generations later, these texts were still copied, which means the memory of the pest and the fear of divine anger stayed strong in royal minds. A state that must perform great seasonal festivals to renew its covenant with the gods and the land will suffer double when famine and disease interrupt the rites. Yazilikaia's procession of stone gods may have seen lean offerings in the last years, an absence that would have troubled king and commoner alike. By the first decades of the 12th century before the Common Era, the empire was gone. The treaties that had named kings and listed curses lay in burned archives. The lions at the gate of Hattusa stared over empty ground. The viceroy of Carchemish still sent letters and counted caravans and received ambassadors, but he spoke now for his own city and its ring of allies rather than for a plateau-wide kingdom. In the countryside of central Anatolia, new peoples took root. Later ages would name some of them Phrygians, and some Mushki, and others by names now lost. They built with timber and stone on old mounds and ploughed fields where Hittite farmers had once brought in winter wheat. The land did not forget the old order. Reliefs at rock faces still showed Hittite kings offering to storm gods, and local shepherds told stories of giants who had carved such works. What remains to the eye today is both grand and melancholy. At Hattusa, the Lion Gate still frames the blue of Anatolian sky. The King's Gate keeps its warrior carved in relief with horned cap and drawn sword. The long gallery of Yazilikaia still leads to the meeting of gods carved in ranks, the storm god and the mother of the land stepping toward one another across the rock. In the museum cases of Ankara, baked tablets hold the curses and promises of a state that trusted to writing as much as to walls. In the ruins of Ugarit Chard, tablets carry the last dispatches that no army answered. On the coast of Cyprus, the slag heaps of copper smelting stand like low hills, reminders of a traffic that once made chariot fittings and spearheads for kings who now are names in clay. Thus the Hittite Empire ceased, not in one battle but in the convergence of failed reigns, empty roads, burning towns, and hungry borders. The disappearance is sudden in the written record because the records themselves ended when the last archive burned and the last scribe fled, yet the people did not vanish in an instant. They shifted to other courts, other scripts, other loyalties. Their gods took new forms. Their language survived in borrowed prayers, and in rock cut hieroglyphs for a time before falling quiet. The kingdom that had matched Egypt in treaty and Mitanni in chariotry and Assyria in law left its stones along the Kizillimak and its treaties in baked clay, and then the wind took the rest. Where the rivers spread their brown fingers into the Gulf of Mexico, where mangrove thickets breathe in the tide and slow waters coil around islands of dark soil, a people of builders and carvers and kings took shape. Their world was the low country of the southern Gulf Coast, in the modern lands of Veracruz and Tabasco, a plain crossed by the Coatzacoalcos, and the Tonala and braided streams that rise in the evergreen mountains and spill to the sea. The air is heavy there, the earth soft and generous, the seasons divided by rain and more rain. It is a country of swamps and levees, of fish-rich lagoons and alluvial fields, and in that saturated abundance, the first great civilization of Mesoamerica grew. Later, neighbors would call them the rubber people because they knew the jungle's trees and the trick of making a ball that could leap from stone, but the names they gave themselves are lost. What remains are their cities raised on earth and clay, their stones pulled from distant volcanoes, and an art so sure of itself that it still startles the eye across 3,000 years. The earliest stirrings can be felt at a sacred spring called El Manati, near the hills east of the Coatzacoalcos Basin, where the peat-preserved wooden busts carved smooth and graceful, bundles of greenstone celts that had never struck a tree, and spheres of cured latex that once bounced in ritual play. The offerings were laid down in the centuries around 1600 before the Common Era, proof that ceremony and skilled carving reached a high pitch before the great centers took final form. Soon after, on a natural ridge above floodplain and marsh, the community we know as San Lorenzo Tenochtitlan rose in tiers. The builders cut and filled and leveled until the crown of the ridge became a platform large enough to carry courts, plazas, and elite compounds. They piped water through U-shaped basalt drains that still lie where they were set, part of a planned system that delivered clean flow to terraces and may have supplied ritual pools that flashed in the sunday. In the rich land below, farmers tended maize and beans and gourds, kept dogs and later turkeys, fished the backwaters, and cut cane for house walls that stood on packed earthen platforms. The common houses vanished with the seasons and the insects, but the great platform endured because the people renewed it generation on generation with basket loads of fill. From the northwest, from the dark cone fields of the Tuxtla Mountains, came the stone that crowned their ambition. Basalt from Cerro Sintipec and other peaks was quarried in heavy masses, roughed out in the highlands, then levered to riverbanks and floated on rafts down twisting channels to the cities of the plain. In courtyards at San Lorenzo and later at La Venta, the stone became altars and thrones and heads that could look a man in the eye. The colossal heads, some higher than 2 men and heavy as a field full of soil, wear close-fitting helmets and carry the facial marks of living rulers. Each is an individual with high cheekbones or fleshy lips, with a gaze that is calm or severe, with a crest or a cord on the helmet that speaks of lineage and office. They were not gods. They were kings frozen in basalt, proof that power had taken human shape and could be seen from across a plaza. As San Lorenzo reached its strength, a second heart rose on a swamp-ringed island farther east. La Venta sits today as a long earthen spine in the Tabasco marshes, but in its age, the place was a city planned with an axis and a face. Builders piled earth and clay into a sacred mountain, a great conical pyramid of packed fill that stood above the palm groves and reed beds, like a man-made volcano answering the real cones on the horizon. Plazas stretched north and south along a central line offset from true north by several degrees, a deliberate orientation that repeats in later sites and suggests a reckoning of sky and season. Along this spine rose low platforms that carried temples and elite houses of wood and thatch, while beneath the plazas lay offerings sealed forever from the light. In one place, a mosaic pavement of worked serpentine was fitted like a green mask and then buried while still new. In others, rows of jade celts were set upright in patterns, as if to plant an eternal field of precious stone. The ground under La Venta is as carefully composed as the architecture above it, a city that is also a reliquary. Trade and pilgrimage bound the low country to the mountains and to far valleys. Jadeite of a blue-green hue came from the Motagua River Valley in distant Guatemala, carried through passes and along canoe routes to the Gulf, where carvers turned it into celts, earspools, and musquets so smooth they feel like water in the hand. Iron ore mirror discs of magnetite and hematite gleamed with the dawn, and likely served in rites where sunlight and reflection mattered more than words. Obsidian blades from highland sources in central Mexico arrived in bundles wrapped against their bite. Conch shells and spondylus from the warm seas added their pale glitter to caches and costumes. In return, the Gulf lowlands sent finished work and the prestige of a style that traveled far. Reliefs carved on the cliffs of Chalcatzingo in the Morelos Hills show rulers seated in caves amid curling clouds in the unmistakable manner of the lowlands, a sign that the symbols and claims of the swamp-born kings were read and copied in the high country. The figure that moves through their art is part child and part cat, with a cleft brow and a mouth that turns down into a curl of power. Scholars call it the were-jaguar, a name from later stories, but the thing itself is older than any tale we have. It is carved on celts, modeled in jade, and set in clay figurines that fit the palm. Rulers are shown cradling such beings as if they were heir and god at once. From thrones cut with niches, a lord emerges as from a cave, holding a rope that binds a captive or a child born to a fate larger than a single life. The message is constant. The ruler holds the line between worlds. He sits at the mouth of the earth serpent. He brings rain and maize by rites that open the way for gods to walk. The plazas and pyramids and buried offerings make a stage for this ritual kingship, and the water drains that carry the rains through stone turn the city itself into a living diagram of flows between sky and underworld. The politics of the rise can be read in the movement of stone and the remaking of platforms. San Lorenzo was first among equals for several centuries, from about 1400 to 900, before the Common Era. Its mound mass was heavier than any other, its drains more elaborate, its heads and altars more numerous. Then its power waned, and La Venta took the mantle. The reasons were likely many. Channels shift and floodplains change, and the ridge that had been a blessing for San Lorenzo may have been cut off from easy water. La Venta controlled an islanded node on the coastward side of the lowlands, a place better suited to gather pilgrims and traders and to project authority outward. The shift did not erase the old elite. Sculptures from San Lorenzo were dragged away, defaced, and recarved at La Venta into new monuments, a violent recycling that reads like history struck with a hammer. The court that ruled La Venta for 3 centuries knew how to claim past glory and turn it to present use. What did their cities and people look like when this power was new? Imagine the long line of La Venta at dawn with mist lifting off the marsh, the conical pyramid rising like a green-gold hill above the palms, the main plaza stretching toward the north, the earthen platforms catching the first light. On the packed clay court stands a throne carved from a single block of basalt, its front a deep niche where a seated figure holds a rope that runs to a kneeling captive. On one flank, a line of stone columns stands like a palisade of trunks turned to stone. In the shadow of the pyramid, workers open a trench to receive a cache of jade celts, each celt ground to a careful sheen and set upright in a fan, so that from above it would look like a sprouting field. Beyond the temple zone, the living city spreads along levees and artificial islands. Houses are raised on platforms to lift them above flood. Looms click in the shade where cotton and maggie become cloth and cord. Fishermen slip into canoe channels cut through the reeds. In a workshop, a carver leans over a block of basalt, checking a curve against the memory of a face he has seen in audience. On the ridge at San Lorenzo, masons lift a basalt drain into a trench and tap it level with a tool of hardwood. When the first rains come, the water will run true. Writing was not their first language. They spoke in stone and clay, and in the placement of things. Yet somewhere in the late reign of Levanta, a portable text was born. The Cascajal block, a smooth slab of serpentinite covered with rows of incised signs, appears to hold a local script in a sequence that suggests ordered reading. The signs are not yet understood and the context is lost, but the artifact tells us that record-keeping began to rise from the realm of image toward the realm of written speech before the old centers faded. In later centuries, the heirs of this tradition on the isthmus would cut dates and names with confident strokes, but the seed may have been planted among these swamp-born kings who needed more than seal stones and memory to run their courts. The Olmec rise cannot be separated from the jungle's gifts. Rubber for ball and binding, cacao for drink that quickens the heart, hardwoods for beams and canoes, fish and turtles for protein, birds for bright feathers, and fertile silts renewed by flood for maize fields that could carry a city. They learned the grace of raising ground above water and of cutting channels to move goods and people through a forest of reeds. They perfected earthwork architecture on a scale that seems understated beside later stone cities, but with an order and a persistence that made hills where there were none and turned islands into sacred mountains. They gathered stone from far peaks because the lowlands had none, and by that labor they declared that power lived on their platforms and not only where basalt was born. By the time Levanta reached its full breadth, around 900 to 500 before the Common Era, the Low Country was the theatre of a cosmology built in mud and jade. The layout of the site measured the world in lines and cardinal points. The pyramid was the axis that joined sky and earth. The buried mosaics and offerings were messages to the powers below. The colossal heads fixed the faces of living lords on the edge of plazas where crowds could see them. The art that traveled to high valleys and coastal slopes carried that same message in smaller form, where local princes seated themselves in caves carved into stone or wore earspools of green that whispered of authority learned from the marsh. Thus the Olmecs rose, not by fortress walls or written decrees, but by reshaping the land and placing kings at the center of a ritual map that tied river, mountain, and sea. Their cities looked like islands made intentional, their courts like earth made into memory. They set the pattern of sacred rulership, of planned ceremonial centers, of long-distance exchange in precious goods, and of a visual language that later peoples would adopt and make their own. When we walk their plazas today beneath the sun of Veracruz and Tabasco, with the reeds ticking in the wind and the soil still smelling of water, we stand in the first chapter of Mesoamerican history written in clay and stone. At La Venta, the Low Country gathered itself into ceremony and command. The city rose from the marsh like a crafted island, its spine a planned axis that drew the eye toward a man-made mountain of packed earth. Around that pyramid stretched broad plazas edged with low platforms where wooden halls once stood, their walls painted and roofed in palm, their floors hard with burnished clay. Within the sacred precinct known to archaeologists as Complex A, columnar basalt from the Tuxtla Peaks was planted upright in ranks to fence sanctuaries of soil and jade. Beneath the plazas lay offerings as carefully arranged as any temple above the ground. Serpentine blocks fitted into green mosaics were laid flat and then buried forever. Rows of jadeite celts stood on edge like a field of blades awaiting rain. In one cache, a procession of tiny stone figures faces a set of polished celts as if standing before a council of ancestors. These hidden works show a city that planned as much below the surface as upon it, a capital that composed the earth as a kind of scripture. From this ceremonial heart, the rulers projected a vision of order, that bound the swamp and the ridge, the river and the sea. They were kings who were also priests, men whose likenesses stare out from colossal heads with helmets tight to the brow and cords and crests that signaled rank. Thrones carved from single blocks show a seated lord inside a cave-shaped niche with a rope looped to a captive or a child. In these scenes, the ruler sits at the mouth of the underworld and holds the line between worlds. The court managed water with equal care. Basalt drains carried clean flow across terraces, a feat practical for daily life and potent in ritual, since flowing water is the oldest metaphor of blessing in lands of flood and drought. Feasting sealed the bond between center and countryside. Animal bones and serving vessels from ceremonial zones speak of gatherings where food and drink were consumed in quantity, and the hierarchy was reaffirmed in public gaze. Number 1.3. Number. Economy and statecraft traveled together along watery roads. Jadeite from the Motagua Valley in the distant highlands came down to the coast and up the rivers to La Venta, where court lapidaries drilled beads and ground earspools until they shone like living leaves. Obsidian arrived from far volcanic fields, its colors betraying sources in the central Mexican and Guatemalan highlands, and blades from those cores gleam still with an edge that can shave hair. Mirror discs of magnetite and hematite, likely from the mountains to the west and south, caught sun and firelight and may have served in rites of divination and kingship. In return, the Gulf sent finished objects and a grammar of sacred images that strangers learned as one learns a strong language. At Chalcatzingo on the highland Piedmont, a lord sits within a mountain cave amid curling clouds in the lowland manner, proof that the prestige of the marsh kings reached into valleys where maize fields run up to dry hillsides. On the Pacific slope at Izapa and along the Chiapas Depression, altars and stelae borrow forms first seen in the swamp. The reach was not conquest in the manner of marching armies, but a weaving of trade, marriage, pilgrimage, and imitation, all of it anchored by the ability of La Venta to host and to give. Politics can be read in stone and fill as clearly as in letters. La Venta drew labor from a wide hinterland to raise its pyramid and renew its platforms. Such works presume a hierarchy that could command seasons of toil and compensate the people with protection, feasting, and the promise that the gods favored the hand that built. Thrones and colossal heads were set and then reset, some recarved from older monuments, suggesting that new rulers reworked the faces and claims of their predecessors to suit present need. The court anchored its power with shrines on the margins of the city, little stations at levee ends and canal mouths, where symbols were renewed and crop rites performed, so that villages saw the center as the guardian of harvest and flood. Rival elites in neighboring districts answered with their own platforms and carvings, and sometimes with defacement and removal of La Venta-style sculptures. For the politics of this landscape was a long conversation in stone that included threat and theft as well as homage. Religion shaped the daily look of power. The sacred mountain was not only the Great Pyramid, it was also the living horizon of the Tuxtla cones, brought into the city by basalt and by icon. The word jaguar child with cleft brow appears in jade and clay as a being both tender and terrible, carried by rulers in public rite, a sign that rulership was thought to channel storm, fertility, and lightning. Stingray spines, shark teeth, and bloodletting implements found in offerings point to rites of wounding that drew life from life to secure favor from the hidden world. Rubber balls offered at El Manati and stoneball courts at later sites show that ritual play was already a language of cosmos and rule. La Venta gathered these practices into a calendar of processions across its courts so that the very movement of priests and dancers measured the year. At their zenith, the Olmec centers looked both sumptuous and ordered. Approach La Venta by canoe in the season after rains. The swamp breathes at either hand. Herons lift and settle among the reeds, and the platform of the city rises out of water like the back of a long beast. The cone of the pyramid stands beyond a wide plaza. Thrones of basalt sit at the edges like black altars. In the shade of an elite compound, jade beads lie in trays beside shell and obsidian, while a carver tests the bite of a drill. Across the river at a feeder village, women grind maize on stone metates and men mend nets before carrying baskets of fish to the causeway that runs up to the court. In the evening, the rulers descend the pyramid steps to light braziers before a line of buried offerings that no commoner will ever see, proof that mystery is as necessary to power as bread. Thus the height of the Olmec world rested on three pillars. First, mastery of earthwork architecture that turned swamp and ridge into a map of cosmos. Second, a long-distance economy in precious things that tied distant valleys to the Gulf and made the court a broker of beauty and prestige. Third, a theology of kingship in which the ruler stood between worlds and guaranteed rain and harvest through rite and spectacle. Enemies were not legions but rival lords and restless waters. The first answered with imitation and theft. The second answered with flood and drought. For a time, La Venta met both with surplus, ceremony, and stone. The low country that had fed the courts with fish and maize and bright stones also contained the seed of their undoing. Rivers on the Gulf Plain are living creatures. They meander and split. They shed old channels and open new mouths to the sea. Around 900 years before the Common Era, San Lorenzo's ridge lost its favor. Channels that once brought easy water and traffic shifted away, and the engineered drains that had carried clean flow across terraces fell silent. In the final phases, the great platforms show hurried repairs. Monuments were toppled or buried, and some were hacked to pieces and cast into ravines. Colossal heads that once faced across plazas with the assurance of living rulers were recut from older thrones, their new faces set where a lord had once sat within a niche. The violence recorded in stone speaks to political overturn as clearly as any written chronicle. A ruling house fell, and its emblems were mutilated to break the spell of its name. When the ridge lost its water, and its masters lost their luck, the center that had commanded the marsh for centuries began to empty. The farms and hamlets on the levees endured, but the courtly city dwindled to a memory carried by the weight of abandoned basalt. La Venta rose in that same century and wore the mantle of kingship with stern confidence. For generations, it gathered jade from the Motagua Valley, iron ore from western hills, and obsidian from volcanoes high above the clouds. It planted columnar basalt, like a fence of stone trunks, and buried serpentine mosaics that no commoner would ever see. Yet here also the ground tells of a planned ending. Sometime around 400 years before the Common Era, fire passed through temples and courtyards. Basalt columns were pulled down, thrones were smashed and reset as offerings. Caches of greenstone were interred with deliberate care, as if to return wealth to the earth. In the sacred precinct, the builders laid fresh clay to seal the precinct's heart, and then walked away. There is little sign of a foreign army taking the city by storm. Rather, we see a ritual decommissioning, an ending staged by people who still had the strength to bury their gods. When the last processions crossed the great plaza, the man-made mountain still stood above the palm groves, but the voice that had called the marsh to order had chosen silence. Power did not vanish from the lowlands. It changed its shape and shifted its seat. West along the Papaloapan and south toward the Isthmus, Tres Zapotes and Laguna de los Cerros grew as new capitals. Their plazas were lower and more open. Their mounds spread in wider clusters along natural rises, their sculpture more varied in style. At Tres Zapotes, the old tradition of colossal heads continued, one of them with heavy eyelids and a helmet strap carved in the old manner. Yet beside these stand stelae that record dates in the long count, a new reckoning that names a day across centuries. One fragment known as Stela C preserves an early long count from the last century before the Common Era, proof that the heirs of the Marsh Kings were finding a different way to anchor power in time. The script that accompanies these dates blooms later along the isthmus at La Mojara and on the Tuxtla statuette, a local writing that scholars call Epi Olmec or Isthmian. On those stones a ruler stands with regalia heavy as armor, and the text climbs beside him like a ladder of breath, recording deeds and rites in a voice that the swamp had not used before. The old images of cave mouths and Wajaguar children do not disappear, but they share space with a new public language of names and days and conquests. Why did the First Order yield to this second one? The reasons converge like flooded streams. On an alluvial plain, ceremonial platforms and canals demand constant labor to keep their edges sharp against water that wants to soften all things. If a channel wanders, a port of landing dies. If a levee goes untended for a season, the river takes it back. Even in good years, the low country exacts a tax of sweat. At times the rains fail or fall too hard, and the harvest swings from feast to hunger. A court that has promised to regulate water and secure fertility must answer for flood and drought alike. When the promise cannot be kept, rivals stir in neighboring districts, and masked men cut the cords on old thrones. Beyond the marsh, new hilltop powers were rising that drew trade into other paths. To the west in the Oaxaca highlands, Monte Alban climbed a ridge and laid out terraces and temples along a fortified spine. To the south and east on the Pacific Piedmont and in the Chiapas Depression, Izapa and its neighbors filled their plazas with stelae that echoed lowland forms while naming their own lords. In the far lowlands of Petén and the Guatemalan Mirador Basin, early Maya centers grew around great platforms and causeways that drank labor from the forest. The road of jade and obsidian now had many inns, and La Venta was only one among several grand hosts. There are smaller signs that tell of stress carried in ordinary lives. At La Venta and San Lorenzo, midden layers from the last phases show changes in diet and refuse that suggest households were storing less surplus and eating a broader array of small fish and turtles. In some neighborhoods, rebuilding became thinner and shorter-lived, as if families were less willing to invest in houses that might be abandoned. Monument recarving and relocation became a policy rather than a rare gesture. Old heads were buried face down. Throne-like altars were hacked into new forms and dragged to different courts. Such acts carry both piety and threat, ritually closing one order while the new order cleans the stage for itself. None of it points to the sort of pitched battle that later histories celebrate. Rather, it reads as faction, usurpation, and the redirected labor of villages whose leaders chose a different center to support. What did these last seasons look like on the ground? In the wet months, canoes still moved along reed-walled channels, and the conical pyramid of La Venta still rose over mist. But more platforms went unplastered. A basalt throne lay on its side, while teams chipped at its corners to free a block for a new monument in a new precinct. At San Lorenzo, the elegant drains, once kept free for ritual flow, silted and filled with leaf mold and the bones of small animals. Masons pried at the sockets of columnar basalt and packed them onto rafts bound for other towns. In the villages, elders told the old stories of rulers who emerged from caves with a rope in their hand. But younger men wore earspools incised with newer signs and spoke of dates and journeys and victories recorded on standing stones. The map of the sacred world was not erased, it was redrawn. By 400 years before the Common Era, La Venta had ceased to be a capital. The long axis was still there, the pyramid still stood, but the courts were quiet and the basements of buried offerings were sealed to time. The heart of the old order had stopped beating. The people did not die out. They farmed the same levees and fished the same lagoons and boiled cacao in the same clay cups. They served new courts at Tres Zapotes, Cerro de las Mesas, and other centers along the rivers. They spoke languages that were cousins to the old and learned scripts that their ancestors had not needed. They played the ball game on courts of packed earth and carried rubber balls to shrines as their grandparents had done at El Manati. In the highlands and far forests, other peoples borrowed and changed what the marsh kings had made. The Maya would take the grammar of planned centers and long count dates to cosmic heights. The Zapotecs would carve rulers and captives on dressed stone and rule from their great hill. The inheritance of the lowlands passed to many hands. What remains now are the signs of both greatness and departure. At San Lorenzo, carved monuments lie in ravines as if the earth had swallowed a procession. At La Venta, the conical pyramid still rises, a green mound against the blue of the Gulf sky, while the museum cases nearby hold serpentine blocks that once made a buried mask as large as a room. At Tres Zapotes, the broken face of Stela Sea preserves a count of days that reaches back before the birth of most later cities, an act of memory and ambition that closes one story and opens another. The disappearance of the first Olmec order was not a vanishing into air, but a transformation across rivers and centuries. The kings of the marsh stepped down from their thrones of basalt, and other voices took up the chorus they had begun. In the red heart of the Shara Mountains, where sandstone cliffs lean together like closing hands, a narrow gorge leads into a basin ringed by rock. This is Petra, the valley of Wadi Musa, where springs rise out of stone and winter floods roar down dry channels. The land lies between the high plateau of Edom and the deep scar of the rift, within reach of the Dead Sea to the northwest and the caravan roads that run south along the Hejaz toward the incense groves of Arabia. From these ridges and wadis, an Arab people emerged whose gift was to turn desert into a gate and scarcity into power. They were the Nabateans, first riders and tent dwellers, then engineers and merchants, and at last masters of a city carved from living rock. Their beginnings are written in the habits of the land. The early Nabateans moved with herds across steppeland, following sparse rains and spring pastures, yet they did not wander aimlessly. They learned every waterhole and hidden seep from the Negev to the Hejaz, and they guarded them with a care sharper than any wall. Where a basin could be cut deeper, they cut it. Where a runoff channel could be captured, they angled it toward a cistern and sealed the walls with lime. Archaeological surveys in Petra's hinterland have mapped hundreds of installations, small dams stepped across side valleys, rock-cut gutters tight against the cliff, settling tanks, covered channels that keep water cool in the worst heat. These works begin as the people settle, then multiply as the settlement grows, until the city and its countryside become a net that catches a scarce gift and spreads it according to rule. Water was their first treasure and their first lesson in statecraft. The gorge that leads into Petra, a long cleft that the people called the Sick, is both theatre and shield. Walls of rosestone rise so high that a man feels the sky squeezed to a ribbon. In antiquity, the Nabateans cut twin channels along the rock, each carrying water from the upland springs toward the city. One runs as a groove with coverstones still in place. The other carries terracotta pipes held by stone brackets chiseled straight from the cliff. Floods that would drown a man were slowed by diversion dams and catch basins long before they reached the mouth of the gorge. An enemy who found the entrance found only shadowed turns, where a handful of archers could rule a host. A merchant who came in peace found cool air and the sound of water, and then the sudden flare of sunlight as the gorge opens into the heart of Petra. Long before they raised facades in stone, the Nabateans built an economy out of wind and distance. South of Petra, the land opens into the route that leads through the Hejaz to the incense groves of Dhofar and Hadramaut. Frankincense and myrrh traveled north in caravans, each sack as dear as money, each stop measured by the next reliable water. Eastward routes brought pearls and spices from Gulf ports. Westward tracks crossed the Negev toward the Mediterranean at Gaza. Along the Dead Sea, the Nabateans gathered bitumen in dark cakes and ferried it to clients in Egypt, where embalmers prized it for ritual and craft. To the northeast, copper was mined at Wadi Fainan and moved to markets with the same practiced caution that guarded incense. The Nabateans guided these rivers of goods, and they taxed them, sometimes with toll shelters and scribes, sometimes just with a guard at a spring and a promise that a caravan would find the next water sweet if it had paid at the last. The first time their name breaks through the haze of legend is in the writings of Diodorus, who tells of a raid sent by the Macedonian successor Antigonus in the year 312 before the Common Era. The general Athenaeus found the Nabatean camp while the men were away trading and took rich booty, but the desert fought for its own. The Nabateans returned by night, fell upon the camp, and slew many. A second expedition came, larger and more wary. The Nabateans lured it into broken country and turned back the invaders again. These tales are not court histories, they are warnings to rivals. Do not chase these people into their land. You will lose the road, the water, and your life. In the decades that followed, they learned to parley as well as to fight. They balanced between the Ptolemies who held Egypt and the Seleucids who wanted Syria and the routes east. The Nabateans struck where they must and traded where they could, and their tents became pavilions where Greek envoys and Arab chieftains spoke over cooled water and bargaining gifts. Petra itself took shape as the people settled the basin and its flanking slopes. Houses first were of mud and timber, then cut into the soft sandstone as chambers and arcades, then faced with dressed fronts that blended foreign taste and local stone. The living city stood on terraces, not only in the floor of the basin, but on ledges a man can still see along the walls of Jebel al-Madba and Jebel Huptha. Fields were cut into steps along the hills, held by rubble revetments, fed by runoff conduits and spring channels. Olives and vines took root where only juniper had clung. Orchards and grain plots stitched the lower slopes until the basin became a mosaic of food and household water that could carry a population secure through dry years that would have broken smaller towns. Their gods watched from heights and from black stones set in niches. The chief was Dushara, lord of the mountain, honored in open-air precincts where altars and rock-hewn basins still receive the winter rains. Female powers known to Greeks as Aphrodite and to Arabs as Al-Uzza and Alat stood beside him in betyls, aniconic stones that fix the presence of divinity without human form. High places on the ridges bear carved basins for libations and steps that lead to outlooks where both city and sky are visible, proper places to seal a treaty or give thanks for rain. Inscriptions in Nabatean Aramaic, cut beside these shrines and on tomb facades, show a written habit taking hold. The script becomes increasingly cursive as the centuries pass, and in its flowing lines later scholars see the ancestry of Arabic letters. Society in this rise held to the virtues of the camp even as the city grew. Mobility never entirely ceased. Herds still moved, and men still knew the valleys by smell and sound. But a class of merchants and administrators rose, who could count and record, who could plan budgets of water and projected caravan traffic as coolly as a farmer plans sowing and harvest. The kings appear first as names in Greek books and on coins, then as names in their own inscriptions. Aretas is the royal name that repeats through the generations. The earliest Aretas belongs to the 3rd century before the Common Era, a sign that the people saw themselves as a polity with a single voice. Tomb architecture and cult gifts show that wealth concentrated in families who supervised trade and water, yet even a modest household in Petra had access to a level of comfort rare in desert towns. Channels brought water into courtyards. Cisterns under floors held reserve. In the hottest days, a patio would show a small fountain playing in the shadow of a fig. Caravan power needs outposts. As Petra grew, the Nabateans armed the routes with stations that were both watchposts and markets. North to the Hauran, the basalt lands that would later be called Batanea, they planted farms and sent taxmen to the town that would become Bostra. West, across the Arabah and the Negev, they raised road stations and shrines at places later known as Avdat and Shivta, where travelers could rest and animals be watered. South into the Hejaz, the wells of Hegra became a second stone city in the making, its cliffs dotted with early tombs. The writing on those cliffs is Nabatean. The hand that carved them learned in Petra. Even before the great facades that tourists admire today were born, the network was in place that made the city their capital in truth. Currency followed. In the 1st century before the Common Era, the Nabateans began to mint coins that carried Greek legends and images alongside their own names and symbols. Silver and bronze issues paid troops and lubricated markets. The coinage also spoke a political language to neighbors. It's said that the desert house now sat among kings who set their faces on metal and claimed dates and borders. The balance of power around them had not grown gentler. Seleucid rule in Syria withered into quarrels. The Hasmoneans rose in Judea and pushed east and south. The Ptolemies clung to the Nile. Roman eyes were already looking east along routes that mattered more than maps. The Nabateans did not yet answer with grand walls or with columns in Roman manner. They answered with water security, with forward bases, with diplomats and guides, and with the knowledge that every rival who came into their country drank by their pleasure. Petra's look in this age was functional beauty. The city had markets and caravan yards where camels were loaded and shaved for sores and salted against thirst. It had workshops where metal from Finan was cast, where leather was cured, where glass from coastal furnaces was cut and traded on. It had sanctuaries in the open air and in the shelter of caves. It had a council hall where chiefs turned merchants sat on stone benches and counted revenue in incense, copper, and coin. At sunrise, the cliffs took color from coral to crimson to old rose. At night, the rock held heat for a while and bled it back to the alleys and steps until the air cooled toward dawn. The city was difficult to take and profitable to serve, which is the kind of city that lives. This is how the Nabateans rose, by mastering water in a dry land, by turning a caravan road into a taxable river, by balancing between the kingdoms on either side of the desert until both treated them as necessary. By settling a city whose defenses were geology and whose wealth was trust. They began as riders whose law was the skin of a water bag, and they became keepers of an entrepot that bound Arabia to the Mediterranean. By the 1st century before the Common Era and the 1st century after, the Nabatean kingdom stood astride the deserts as a broker of routes and a maker of cities. From Petra's Rose Basin, they reached north to the basalt uplands of the Hauran, south to the wells of Hegra in the Hejaz, west across the Negev to the ports of the Mediterranean, and eastward toward the Gulf and the long roads that touch Mesopotamia. Kings named Obodas, Aretas, Malichus, and Rabel turned caravan cunning into policy. Under Aretas III, who styled himself Philhellene, the kingdom took Damascus for a season and struck coins that carried Greek legends beside royal titles, a public claim that a desert house had entered the society of monarchs. Petra remained the heart, yet the realm was a chain of strengthened stations and growing towns, with Bostra in the north, Avdat and Mampsis in the Negev, and Hegra among sandstone domes that rise from the Hejazi plain. At the Red Sea, the Nabateans worked the harbour at Eila, where the Gulf of Aqaba narrows, and they watched the coast farther south at a place classical writers call Luke Kome, a roadstead that received aromatics and Indian goods for the long haul inland. Politics sharpened their rise. To the west, the Hasmonean rulers of Judea pressed toward the Arabah and Gaza. Alexander Jannaeus seized Gaza and tried to choke the incense road, but Obodas I caught him in broken country near Gadara and threw his army downslope to a ruin that Judean chronicles remembered bitterly. Later, Aretas III stepped into the quarrels of Syria and Judea, sometimes as enemy and sometimes as arbiter, while Seleucid power withered. Then Rome came east. Pompey took Damascus and reorganized Syria. The Nabateans yielded the city but kept the roads that mattered. They learned to send timely gifts to governors and to the friends of governors, to negotiate tolls and borders with men who wore scarlet and kept tablets sealed with eagles. They also learned that Roman favor could turn with a whisper. Mark Antony gave Cleopatra ambitions along the Arabah and near the balsam groves of Jericho. Malichus refused her claim. Herod of Judea fought the Nabateans, and at times bled them, and at times lost to them, and then bound himself to Augustus. Through these tempests, the kings of Petra held their own by a talent for timing, for tribute, and for making every rival need what only they could easily provide. Trade was the kingdom's engine, and the roads its arteries. Frankincense and myrrh rose out of the groves of Dhofar and Hadramaut, packed in leather sacks and escorted by men who knew every water in the Hejaz. From the Gulf came pearls and aromatics, from Mesopotamia fine textiles and metalwork, from Egypt glass and grain in exchange for bitumen and copper. The Nabateans taxed at springs and passes, kept caravanserais provisioned, and leased camels by the hundred. Storage yards at Petra and Hegra held aromatics in sealed jars until a convoy assembled, and accountants tallied duties in silver and in kind. When the Periplus later praised the monsoon sea route that carried Indian goods directly to the Red Sea, Nabatean merchants were already present in those harbors, redirecting cargo upriver to Eila and in turn to Petra. The kingdom did not fear the sea, it used it. What mattered was control of transfer points where desert skill could name a price. The look of power in Petra took on stone. At the city's ceremonial core rose Qasr al-Bint, a great temple of ashlar blocks set on a high podium with a broad stair, the house of the god Dushara, where processions ended and sacrifices smoked. Nearby sprawled the great temple quarter with its colonnaded courts, broad staircases, and a theatre-like assembly space where kings and council received deputations. A colonnaded street ran the length of the basin, flanked by workshops and markets, and punctuated by a nymphaeum that caught spring water in a cool basin under shade. On the northern slope, the theatre was carved from living sandstone into ranks that could seat a city. The cliffs themselves became a necropolis and a proclamation. Facades were cut deep into the rock with pediments and columns that imitate the language of Greek and Egyptian rulers, while remaining stubbornly Nabatean. The treasury greets a visitor where the sick bursts into the sun, its broken pediment and central tholos cut so crisp that the stone seems to hold breath. The monastery sits high on a western ridge, reached by steps that climb through juniper and shadow, its broad doorway opening into a hall that smells of dust and old ceremony. Tomb inscriptions name families and impose heavy fines on any who would reuse or damage a grave, an epigraphic law that turned cliff faces into courts of record. Water made all of this possible. The rock walls of the Sick carry twin channels, one cut as an open groove under capstones and one lined with terracotta pipes held by brackets chiseled straight from the cliff. Dams at the mouth of the gorge diverted floodwaters into side channels so that winter torrents did not scour the city clean. Cisterns were rock-hewn and plastered until they held against years of scant rain. Gardens lay within the basin where water could be carried by hand and by hidden conduits. The Nymphaeum pooled under fig and willow. On the heights, open-air sanctuaries hold basins for libations that still fill after a storm. It is not a single work that impresses so much as the total plan. In a land where a mist rain can kill a flock, Petra's water system turned risk into routine and routine into confidence. Religion and court culture walked together. The god of the mountain was honored in betels, sacred stones that felt the sky and did not need a carved face. Female powers stood beside him under other ancient names. At Khirbet et Tanur and Khirbet Eid Dari, north of Petra, temples crown ridges with altars open to the wind, their sculptures a mixture of local symbols and Mediterranean ornaments. Priests and priestesses served at these places with an eye both to old customs and to the tastes of foreign envoys. The coinage carries royal heads and divine symbols, often with legends in Nabatean Aramaic and sometimes in Greek. A public message to caravans and to governors that the kingdom spoke more than one language and could reckon more than one calendar. The pottery perfected in this age is a signature of the court. Nabatean fine ware is thin as an eggshell and often painted with red vines and flowers that seem to move when a cup is turned. It is a luxury made from humble clay, an emblem of what this people did best. The realm was never only Petra. Hegra in the Hehés became a stone sister whose tomb facades climb sandstone buttes and bear inscriptions that name guilds, clans, and magistrates. The texts fix ownership, post fines, and call down curses as serious as any carved in Latin. In the Negev, the Nabateans built farms that caught runoff with terrace walls and channeled it to orchards and vines. Presses cut into bedrock show that wine left the desert in amphorae bound for coastal markets. On the basalt plains of the Hauran, Bostra grew from a way station into a royal seat in the north, anchored by fertile fields and basalt block architecture that laughed at fire. The kingdom knit these varied lands with milestones and mansio-like stations, with patrols that kept watch for raiders, and with scribes who could settle a tariff argument before it grew into a blood feud. Their enemies did not cease in this high age. Herod Antipas cast off a daughter of Aretas IV, and the insult brought war along the frontier. Antipas was beaten, and only the death of Tiberius halted a Roman punitive campaign. The lesson was remembered on both sides of the Arabah. Rome learned that these desert kings could fight hard when cornered, and that it was cheaper to deal with them as friends. The Nabateans learned that a Roman order could push an army to the edge of Petra in a season if the emperor desired it. After this, the kings presented themselves as loyal allies who kept roads safe and sent gifts at the proper festivals. Augustus and his successors accepted the arrangement so long as tribute and quiet arrived together. Walk Petra at noon in this era of confidence. The colonnades throw bars of shade on paving stones. Officials in white linen step from the great temple with tablets and seals. A string of camels rises from the depths of the Sick, bells chiming, loaded with sacks that smell of resin and pepper. At Khazar al-Bint, the courtyard gleams, and a priest draws water from a basin to wash a betel before the midday rite. The theatre sleeps under the sun, its seats flushed with the color of raw meat. Up on a ridge, the monastery looks across the Wadi Arabah to where the blue line of the rift glitters. Below, workshops hammer copper from Fainan into kettles and fittings, while a potter turns a jar whose walls ring like a bell when he flicks it. Every sound and surface declares a city that governs itself and governs the roots that feed it. So the Nabateans reached their height. They married the precision of engineers to the instincts of caravaneers. They dressed their rulers in a blend of Arab rite and Mediterranean fashion that spoke to every guest. They took the taxes of 3 deserts and part of a sea. They housed their god on a podium of stone and wrote their law upon cliffs that keep it to this day. Power like this rarely ends from a single blow. It fades when roads change, when rivals offer easier terms, when emperors grow impatient, when a sea route outbids a land route, when a client becomes a province. Those currents were already rising beyond the ridges. Power ebbs first along the edges where caravan bells grow faint and warehouses stand too long between convoys. For the Nabateans, the first chill came from the sea. Roman administrators learned the rhythm of the monsoon and favored direct sailings from the Indian coast to Red Sea ports, where customs houses could tax cargo before a single camel was hired. The Periplus praised harbors like Myos Hormos and Berenike, and the grain fleets from the Nile carried pepper and silk northward with a speed no overland train could match. Petra still gathered incense and bitumen and copper, yet the richest packets of trade now touched Roman quay before they touched Nabatean hands. The old mastery of wells and passes met a rival with oars and seasonal winds. Politics followed the cargo. In the last generation of the kingdom, the court at Petra still minted coins and set up inscriptions that named the king Rabble, styled Sota, and praised his sister Gamelat. Yet Roman governors in Syria and Judea pressed closer. Aretas had crossed and recrossed lines with Herod and with the Caesars, winning on some fronts and losing on others, but the pattern of compromise gave way to the patience of empire. In the year 106, after the death of Rabble II, the forces of Trajan under Cornelius Palma advanced without recorded battle. The realm of the caravan became the province of Arabia. The capital for the governor moved north to Bostra, on the basalt plain where Legio Tertia kept order, and where paved streets and baths announced a new center of gravity. Petra remained a city of rank and memory, granted metropolitan status, and honored when Hadrian himself visited, but the counting houses of the province stood under new eagles. Rome did not strangle Petra, it refitted her. The Via Nova Traiana ran like a stone spine from Bostra to Aila on the Gulf, its mile markers inscribed in Latin and its stations provisioned for troops and traders. The theatre at Petra was enlarged. The colonnaded street was straightened and paved. A great nymphaeum caught spring water in a cool basin. And baths rose where citizens could gossip under vaults while steam drifted from hot rooms into winter light. Temples on the ridges kept their old altars and added ornaments in Mediterranean taste. Nabatean fine ware continued to ring like bells when tapped, now sold beside imported glass. Hegra in the south cut its last grand tomb facades early in this Roman age and then fell quiet. The caravan stations across the Negev still gathered runoff for vines and presses. An amphorae of desert wine reached coastal markets by way of Gaza. For a time, the Rose City lived as a proud provincial capital in all but name, prosperous enough to hide the erosion that had begun. The deeper shift came when rivals learned to command the desert in other tongues. Palmyra rose on the Euphrates, fringe as a new broker of routes. Its caravans walked the steppe under the protection of treaties with governors and with tribes, and its merchants carved their own accounts on stone in Aramaic and in Greek. In the 3rd century, when the Roman world tottered, Palmyrene princes and then a queen named Zenobia made bold to rule Syria and Egypt and to tax the road that once answered first to Petra. The north drew trade like a magnet, and the southern reaches starved. Petra stayed loyal to Rome and received kind words and municipal improvements, but the caravans thinned, and what cargo did pass was more often counted in Bostra than in the red basin of Wadi Musa. Nature added its own hard verdict. In the year 363, an earthquake struck the highlands of the south. At Petra, walls cracked, columns fell, and the water system suffered the kind of wound that a city in a dry land cannot easily forgive. Channels shifted out of line, plastered cisterns opened, dams slumped, and the terrifying power of sudden flood returned to the Sikh when winter storms came down from the Shara. Repairs followed and life continued, yet the precision that had made the water net an urban miracle was never fully restored. Later shocks in the 6th and 8th centuries struck the Levant broadly and left the Petra basin with more fractured stone and fewer hands to lift it. Terraces silted, gardens shrank, and houses retreated to the safest ledges and to the quarter around the main spring. The gods changed with the times. Under Rome, the city's sanctuaries added marble and new statues, and the divine names of the mountain were written beside Latin dedications. In the Byzantine age, bishops took their seats and churches rose of cut stone. On the ridge above the colonnaded street, a basilica of 3 aisles was paved with mosaics that still shimmer with birds and vines. In a house nearby, a cache of papyri recorded land sales and dowries and tax disputes in a city that had traded incense for olive groves and vineyards. The great rock-cut hall on the western height we call the monastery became a place of Christian rite, its doorway black with lamp smoke. The treasury doorway saw processions of another faith, and then only tourists of later times can stand to wonder at how many tongues have spoken under its cornice. Religion had not failed. Trade had. The early Islamic centuries shifted the map once more. Aqaba, on the Gulf, reclaimed primacy as a port, and inland routes bent toward Damascus and to the cities of the plain. Petra, off the new lines of march, settled into local life. The Crusaders came and built small castles that crowned sandstone pinnacles, one at Al-Waira above the Sikh, and another at Al-Habis among dark crags, outworks to watch the Arabah and the approach to the spring. Saladin took them and carried the war elsewhere, and the basin returned to farmers and to shepherds who kept orchards under the cliffs and reused cut stones in garden walls. Travelers passed now and then and spoke of a valley of Moses and a tomb of Aaron on the high mountain, but the old name of Petra sank beneath the memory of saints and springs. By then, the people who had carved facades and set finds into stone were long folded into the populations of Syria and Arabia. Their script, once a flowing Aramaic used to mark tombs and contracts, had passed its curves to the letters that would write Arabic and the Quran. Their methods with water and terrace survived in the craft of upland farmers who still step slopes into fields and catch winter rains with rubble walls. Their language of power on coin and altar and facade had vanished from practice, but remained fixed upon the cliff faces for any who could read the old shape of a betyl or the Nabatean style of a capital. The final quiet that overtook Petra was not a sack or a burning that ended a people in a day. It was a centuries-long retreat of significance. First, the sea siphoned away the richest cargoes. Then Rome turned the country into a province with a new northern head. Then competitors gathered the steppe under their protection. Then earthquakes cracked the precise machinery of water that had made a city out of cliffs. Last came new roads of commerce and pilgrimage that did not need to pass the Red Basin. The result was absence. Facades weathered, sand drifted, goats grazed where dignitaries once stepped out of litters. The valley lived, but as a village tucked into ruins whose scale no longer matched the life they sheltered. In the 19th century, a traveler with a gift for languages and a habit of disguise walked through the Sikh to the open court and felt the shock that every visitor feels when the hidden path gives way to carved stone as broad as a Havant. Palace. He gave the old name back to the West and set the scholars to work. That rediscovery is a chapter of modern curiosity rather than of ancient fate. Yet, it closes the circle. Stones do not speak unless someone asks them to, and Petra waited patiently for the question. Where the limestone shelf of the Yucatan lifts from the Caribbean and rolls south into deep rainforest, a civilization learned to build cities in a land without great rivers. The Maya world spread across the northern plains of Yucatan with their dry scrub and sinkholes of cold water, through the central lowlands of Petén and Belize, where seasonal swamps breathe mist at dawn, and into the highlands of Guatemala and Chiapas, where volcanic ridges climb above coffee-colored streams. To the west ran the basins of the Usumacinta and Grijalva, broad corridors for trade and war. To the east, the barrier reef broke the sea into lagoons rich with shell and fish. It is a difficult country for kings. The northern plain offers scant surface water and thin soils above porous stone. The southern lowlands soak in summer rain and then burn under a hard winter Sunday. Yet from these limits came a people who shaped the calendar to the sky, wrote their voices on stone, and raised pyramids whose white plaster once flashed like lightning above a sea of green. The first Maya villages took root near small lakes and gentle ridges around 2,000 years before the Common Era. Farmers tested the Milpa cycle of clearing and fallow, planted maize and beans and squash, and added root crops and cacao where shade and moisture allowed. As families multiplied, they learned to coax more food from stubborn ground. In the Bajos, the broad seasonal swamps of the central lowlands, they built raised fields and dug canals to drain and irrigate at once. Along the Maya mountains, they carved terraces and lined them with stone so that thin soils would not wash away with the first heavy storm. On the northern plain, householders cut bottle-shaped cisterns into the bedrock and plastered them smooth to hold the rains, and they treated the sinkholes called cenotes as both wells and gates to the underworld. Around these inventions rose the earliest ceremonial centers, platforms of packed clay and limestone rubble, stairways faced with cut stone, and low plazas where the first rulers called their people to feast and write. By the Middle and Late Pre-Classic, between 1,000 and 100 years before the Common Era and the centuries that followed, villages became towns, and towns grew large enough to command labor far beyond their walls. At Nakbé and El Mirador in the northern Petén, triadic temple groups rose, 3 pyramids on a single platform with the central tower fronted by 2 companions like flanking hills. El Mirador spread for miles, its causeways running like pale roads through forest to satellite settlements. Its stucco masks the height of a man staring from the slopes of shrines. The La Danta complex climbed in stacked platforms until its crown stood among the largest volumes ever raised in the ancient world, a mountain of human intention faced with shining lime. At Cerros, near the Caribbean shore, rulers flanked stairways with giant masks of gods who breathe wind and bear the bird headdress of the rising Sunday. At San Bartolo, painters covered a chamber with murals in a hand as delicate as any illuminated book. The scenes show mythic cycles and the first maze, kings offering blood to renew the covenant between people and gods, and glyphs that name days and actions in a script already supple and sure. That script is a logosyllabic system of signs for words and syllables, a net that can catch the sound of a language and hold it for centuries. The earliest texts are brief and rare. By the first centuries before and after the Common Era, the habit of writing deepened. Stone stelae and stairways carry dates in a long count that measures time from a mythic beginning, a chain of units that stack from days to centuries, each recorded with bars and dots and with a patron deity for the number. The same cities kept a ritual count of 260 days and a solar count of 365. Together they made a calendar round that bound feasts and births to the memory of cycles. The sky served not only as a clock but as an omen. Priests watched Venus in the dawn and timed warfare to its first appearance after absence. They tracked the sun's zenith passages, set buildings to capture solstice light, and marked the seasons with E-group observatories in which a western pyramid faces a low eastern platform with 3 small temples that frame sunrise points across the year. Kingship took shape beside these instruments of time and place. Rulers called holy lords lifted jade blades and stingray spines and drew blood from tongue and flesh to feed paper that smoldered at the foot of a temple stair. They wore headdresses that rose like green mountains of feathers, belts hung with obsidian teeth, collars of polished shell and jade from the Motagua Valley. They seated themselves upon thrones with stucco masks of gods and ancestors at their feet. Their courts gathered nobles who held lands and lineages, scribes who could play music with signs, and artisans who carved lintels and painted codices on bark paper. Markets met in plazas where salt from northern salinas, cacao from humid groves, cotton and agave textiles, chert tools, and obsidian blades traded hands under the eyes of stewards. In the highlands at Caminaljuyu, a city of earth platform mounds rose near the lakes of the Guatemala Valley and controlled the jade route from the eastern mountains. On the Pacific Piedmont, at Tacalicabage and El Bol, rulers carved stelae with early long-count dates that test and then master the reckoning of deep time. Architecture gave the world a language of stone that is still legible. Maya builders favored local limestone, quarried in blocks and set in thick masonry cores faced with cut stone and sheathed in white plaster that caught paint like skin. On great pyramids, the highest temples carried roof combs of pierced masonry that rose like crests and turned the skyline into a row of crowns. Palaces grew as labyrinths of vaulted rooms around courtyards, each range housing a lineage, a council, a reception suite, or the king's private chambers with benches where he slept under woven cotton. The vaults are corbelled, each course stepping inward until a narrow cap closes the gap, a trick of gravity that could span rooms without the true arch. Ball courts cut their double alleys between sloping walls in cities large and small, for the ball game was more than sport. It was a ritual of sun and earth and human fate. Inscriptions speak of captives taken in play and offered in sacrifice, and of lords who won the right to reenact cosmic battles with leather and rubber and stone. Trade reached far and linked the ecologies of the peninsula to the mountains and coasts. Obsidian came from El Chayal and Ixtepeque in the Guatemalan highlands and from Pachuca in central Mexico, its colors and inclusions a fingerprint of source that a trained eye can still read. Jade traveled from the Motagua Valley and found its last form as beads and ear spools and felt so smooth they look wet in the shade. Shell from Caribbean reefs and Pacific shores came inland for ornaments and for the clatter of costume. Salt traveled in cakes from northern pans and from the drowned forests of Paynes Creek, where ancient brine works now lie under black water. Cacao beans moved as both drink and money. The Usumacinta Valley served as a highway for river canoes husky with cargo and for populations on the move in times of ambition or fear. Causeways paved with white marl called Sacbiobe ran between city centers and outlying quarters, and sometimes between cities altogether, a physical expression of alliance and command. The look of Maya cities at their rise combined mass and color. In sunlight, the plastered sides of pyramids gleamed white, while painted friezes and masks carried red and blue and black against the glare. Wooden lintels carved with narrative scenes sheltered doorways. In palaces, the floors were burnished until they took a soft shine, and the sound of sandals on plaster and of voices in a dozen Mayan tongues filled the morning air. At Tikal, stone towers rose above a basin with scattered lakes. At Calakmul, a rival complex stood with twin pyramids facing a plaza the size of fields. At Uaxactun, an observatory group framed the Sunday. At Lamanai, a temple lifted masks of crocodile lordship from its face. In each, the court sat at the head of a causeway like a spider at the center of a pale web. The story of outside influence enters early and carefully. Along the Gulf Plain and into the highlands, the peoples who preceded and paralleled the Maya had already shaped rites and exchange. From the west and north came obsidian and ideas. From the south moved jade and stories of volcano gods. The Maya did not copy, they answered. The triadic temple groups of the Petén are their own answer to the need for a mountainscape in flat land. Their script bends to Maya speech, and by the early classic it carries long names, verb phrases, place signs with titles called emblem glyphs, and dates that pin a king to a day under heaven. By the opening of the 3rd century, the forest canopy hid a world of capitals that could speak at distance through carved stone. What held this world together in its first flowering was a shared grammar of time, a shared cult of ancestors and gods of maize and storm, and a practical genius for making water and soil obey. Farmers rotated fields and tended household orchards of ramon and fruit trees. Officials oversaw reservoirs and canals that turned rainy season pulses into dry season life. Priests watched the sky and declared days for war and feasting. The population climbed and filled the basins and ridges with hamlets and town sites tied to their capitals by labor and ritual. Thus the Maya rose, from villages clustered near lakes and sinkholes to a network of planned centers joined by causeways and bound by calendars and lineages. They learned to make cities in a land that resists cities. They learned to speak across centuries with carved signs. They dressed their kings as living mountains and asked blood and incense to keep the corn growing and the kingship sure. The heights and the falls will come, but in these centuries of invention the pattern was set. In the centuries after the turn of our era, the forest filled with capitals that spoke to one another in stone. The first thunder came from the west, when emissaries from the great city in the basin of Mexico reached the Petén. On a day recorded as the arrival of fire is born in the year we call 378, a foreign general entered Tikal and reshaped its throne. A new king named Yaxnuan Ahian took the headdress, and with him came a martial style and distant alliances that set Tikal again on the upward road. Stelae in the plazas began to carry portraits of lords with round shields and dart throwers, and the names of ancestors were rewritten to fit the new story. From that moment, the central lowlands moved into an age of rivals. 2 constellations gathered power. Tikal sat amid lakes and reservoirs on the Guatemalan plain, and to the north, Calakmul ruled a sea of jungle and dependent towns, a house of the snake that sent envoys and war captains down every causeway. Cities changed their faces to match the ambitions of their courts. At Tikal, the twin Great Pyramids called Temples 1 and 2 rose on either side of a plaza faced in white lime, their roof combs lifting cut stone into the sky like banners of masonry. The grave of Jasor Chan Kawil lay deep beneath the first, his bones dusted with cinnabar, his jade ornaments green as river water in shade. Calakmul answered not with a single tower but with mass spread over acres. Its palace district and twin pyramids sprawled across a low ridge, and thick stucco masks larger than a man stared from the flanks of older shrines. Across the river country at Palenque, a king named K-Inich Janab Pakal ruled from a palace of airy galleries and roofed courts. And when he died after a reign that lasted from youth to old age, masons sealed him in a temple of 9 terraces called the Temple of the Inscriptions. His sarcophagus lay under a great carved lid, and a stairway that began in sunlight descended into cool and scented dark. At Copan on the Motagua route, the 13th king raised a stair of glyphs that tells a dynastic tale in hundreds of blocks, while his predecessor named 18 Rabbit set up monuments as fine as any in the forest, each carved with a hand that understood both muscle and breath. War and alliance bound these places as tightly as trade. Caracol in the Maya Mountains was a rising power that struck Tikal a stunning defeat in the year 562, a day that opened a long silence in the records of the lake city and allowed Calakmul to gather clients across the Petén. Dos Pilas began as a branch of Tikal, then turned its cloak and fought for the Snake Lords, sending raiders down the Pasión and building moats and ramparts when the war returned in kind. Along the Usuma Chinta, Yaxchilan and Piedras Negras faced each other like wrestlers across the water, their kings carving lintels and stelae that proclaim raids, captives, and the bloodletting rites that followed victory. In 695, the tide turned when Jasor Chan Kawil of Tikal met Calakmul in battle and won. Calakmul staggered, its client towns wavered, and for a generation the lake city set the tone of war and ceremony. Courts displayed theology in rooms of cut stone. At Palenque, the builders tamed a stream with an arched aqueduct that ran beneath the palace and kept the courtyards dry in the rains. The stucco panels in the temples of the Cross Group show the founding of the royal line as a sacred act under a world tree whose branches reach through levels of sky and earth. At Yaxchilan, lintels hung above doorways record queens drawing cord through tongue or flesh to call the ancestors, and from the scroll of incense rises a vision serpent whose open jaws reveal a lord armed for battle. At Bonampak, murals in a suite of rooms show an entire program of court life. From musicians and nobles in pale garments, to warriors with painted faces and captives stripped and bleeding in a plaza watched by princes under jaguar pelt canopies. These are not pictures for pleasure. They are records that fix the obligations of nobles and announce the right of a dynasty to rule. The daily machinery of greatness rested on land and water. In the southern lowlands, cities like Tikal and Calakmul managed reservoirs lined with plaster and fitted with filtration boxes of sand and zeolite. Causeways of white marl tied districts to their centers so that labor could be called and tribute counted. Caracols spread agricultural terraces across hills to the horizon and backed them with dams that held rainy season flow for the dry months. In the bajos of the Payton farmers lifted fields on platforms and cut canals to drain and feed them at once. In the north, where the rock swallows water, householders carved cisterns, called chultans, and tended sacred sinkholes as wells and shrines. Markets flourished in plazas, where salt from the north, cacao from humid groves, obsidian blades from El Chayal and Ixtepeque, shell from both coasts, and cotton cloth traded hands while stewards watched weights and measures that needed no scales, only the habit of honest exchange under the eyes of the court. The scribal arts reached a fineness that still startles. Portable vases carry a flowing band of glyphs called the primary standard sequence that names the vessel, its owner, and its use, often for drinking cacao mixed with flowers or chili. Codex-style pottery shows scenes painted in black and red on cream slip as deft as brushwork on bark paper. Carvers set long texts on stelae with full dates and biographies. At Copan, the altar queue shows the founder seated with his 16 successors in a ring, each passing a scepter to the next, a dynastic charter carved in the round. At Quirigua downriver, a city that broke free of Copan, the tallest stele in the Maya world rose from the floodplain, and in 738 its king took Copan's 18-rabbit captive and ended his life with the flint, an act that shifted the jade trade of the Motagua Valley and proved that even a smaller court could rewrite the map with a single day of boldness. Astronomy and calendar were statecraft. Priests tracked the course of Venus and the periods of eclipse and used these cycles to mark days for march and sacrifice. E-group observatories in cities old and new set a western pyramid against an eastern platform with 3 shrines that frame the sun at solstices and equinoxes. Rulers staged period-ending rites at the close of Kayatuns and Baktuns, setting up new stelae and scattering incense and blood, as if to tie human duty to the breath of the sky. Buildings face not only cardinal points but also dates, so that a beam of light enters a chamber on a morning promised generations before by a scribe who measured heaven with string and sighting stone. Not all grandeur was solemn. The ball game echoed in courts framed by sloping walls and stone rings. Players wore belts and yokes and struck a heavy rubber ball with hip and thigh until it caromed along the alley like a dark planet. Victories carried political meaning and sometimes mortal cost. Feasts followed, and bones in middens tell of deer and peccary and turtle, of tamales and cacao, of gourds of pulque and honey drinks. The refuse of abundance swept from palace steps after a night of celebration and left for dogs and ants to argue over in the dawn. From city to city, the look of power kept local flavor. In the Palenque region, white plaster and elegant stucco figures stood out against green hills and the silvery thread of streams. In the Great Basin of Tikal, tall towers with serrated roof combs shouldered above a rolling canopy of leaves. Calakmul presented long fronts of stone and broad platforms, a mountain range of masonry under a sky that always seemed close with heat. Copan built in fine volcanic tuff that took detail like butter and set its squares with altars round and square in company. Yaxchilan stretched along a river bend with doorways framed by lintels carved in deep relief. Each court turned local geology and water to art and message. Trade knitted the whole. Canoes ran the Usumacinta and the Pasión as thoroughfares for jade and obsidian and cacao, and along the coasts, seagoing craft moved salt, dried fish, and fine goods. Overland, hammocks and backframes carried burdens along causeways that gleamed in moonlight. Tribute moved toward capitals and gifts moved back out again, jade and cloth, and salt and knives and honored captives whose fate would be decided before a temple stair when the calendar demanded spectacle. By every sign, the classic heart of the Maya world had achieved a balance of terror and ceremony, of writing and water, of stone and maze. Kings spoke across the forest by glyph and by war cry. Priests spoke to the sky, and the sky answered in the right season often enough to keep faith alive. The population climbed and filled ridges and lake basins, and the centers multiplied until a traveler could walk a week through secondary towns and always see a pyramid rising above ceiba and ramen trees. This was the crest. The signs come first as silences in stone. At Copan, the last great monument is raised in the year we call 822, and after that the plaza never again hears the chisels ring for a new Kayatun ending. At Tikal, the tall towers still stand against the sky, yet the long texts grow fewer and the great stairways sprout brush between their steps. Around Calakmul, the causeways that once shone white with plaster dull to the color of old bone. Farther down, the Pasion at Dos Pilas and Aguateca palaces burn hard and fast, and the rooms are left strewn with obsidian blades and shell inlays, and half-finished bone flutes, a still life of flight that tells of enemies close on the heels of princes. In many cities, the stelae are toppled or defaced by chisels wielded by hands that once bowed to the very faces they now erase. The courtly conversation in glyphs that had spanned centuries breaks into episodes, and then into mutterings, and then into quiet. In the countryside, the earth keeps its own chronicle. Pollen drawn from the mud of Petin lakes shows forest falling to maize during the centuries of growth, and then returning after the 9th century as fields are abandoned and the canopy creeps back over old terraces. Charcoal rises in the last centuries of the classic, as farmers clear harder and burn more fiercely, then fades as the population thins. In the great closed basins of the northern Yucatan, cores from Lake Chichen Canab and other waters speak of repeated droughts between about 800 and 950. Dry spells that lasted not a season but decades and returned in clusters like bad omens repeated. Stalagmites from caves in Belize record the same rhythm in the language of calcite layers laid down thin and pale in lean years. On the plateau of the central lowlands, reservoirs drop and stay low too long, and clay at the bottom settles into a record of thirst that no scribe could soften. Cities built on the promise of water struggle when the promise fails. In the southern lowlands, reservoirs were the city's kidneys that took in the rush of rainy season and gave it back clean in the dry months. When drought shortened the season and storms came harder and dirtier, those organs faltered. Sediment clogged inlets. Algae bloomed in shallow pools under fierce Sunday. At Tikal, the very basins that supplied the palaces show residues of mercury from cinnabar used in ritual paint and also traces of cyanobacteria that would have made the water bitter and dangerous. Wardens could dredge a channel and replaster a tank, but they could not make the rains keep their old appointments. In the Bajos, the raised fields that had once taken a careful balance of drainage and irrigation were left to crack or drown. At Caracol, the terrace walls still held the hillsides in neat ribs, yet the flow behind the little dams grew fickle. In the north, where the land swallows water into limestone, the Chultans still filled, but without steady trade and tribute, the households that kept them could not always carry enough to last the long blue months when clouds refused to grow. War sharpened every shortage. In the 7th century and into the 8th, the forest had been a chessboard of rival courts whose rules were known. Captives were taken on dates that pleased gods and chroniclers. Tribute and marriage could return a defeated town to grace. In the later 8th century, the game turned into something harsher. Fortified hilltop refuges appear on ridges that had never needed walls. Punta de Chimino seals itself behind a causeway cut to serve as a moat. At Aguateca, defensive trenches and palisades slice the approaches to the royal quarter, and when the barrier fails, the palace floor is littered with spears and smashed vessels. Along the Usumacinta, Yaxchilan and Piedras Negras bruise each other until both fade. Pitex Batun towns, empty in a rush, and the sound of their abandonment rolls down river like thunder that never quite becomes rain. Famine leaves marks on bone and midden. In late levels at several sites, the diet widens beyond the preferred meats towards smaller, leaner prey and more pond snails and turtles. Child burials in some districts show enamel defects that speak of episodes of hunger. These are not the pitiful ruins of mass graves after a single pest. They are the slow scars of many lean seasons laid over the lives of those who were children when the kings were already faltering. In the household trash of the terminal classic, imported obsidian declines in quantity and shifts in source, a sign that the old webs of exchange have frayed, and that traders choose nearer quarries over distant ones. Politics falter with the rains. Dynasties that had traced their lineages back to myth find themselves without the means to stage the rites that justify rule. Without the feasts of period endings, without gifts of jade and textiles at market, without the ability to guarantee safe roads and water in the worst month, nobles turn into neighbors and neighbors turn into enemies. Vassal towns risk independence. Some courts move their capital within the same valley to a more defensible hill or closer to a dwindling spring. Some accept newcomers as allies who soon write their own names on lintels. The long dynastic stairs that once listed forebears like a rosary of God-touched names stop several beads short of the number expected. In a system where theology and irrigation and ceremony interlock, a break in one gear grinds teeth in the others until nothing turns. The forest was not empty when palaces failed. People moved. Many went north and west toward more reliable water or toward coasts where salt works and fishing could feed towns even when the interior was dry. Populations climbed again in the Puuk Hills, where limestone ridges offered good building stone, and where masons in Uxmal and Kaba and Sayil faced palaces with intricate latticework and masks of the rain god, whose long nose decorates whole facades. New reservoirs and aguadas were carved and plastered. Trade shifted to routes that favored Chichen Itza, which rose near cenotes that never ran dry, a city that learned to speak both the old language of Maya courts and the newer language of merchants who welcomed travelers from across the Gulf. In the south, Copan dwindled to a town, and then to scattered hamlets. Around the Mirador Basin, the great pre-classic platforms slept under vines and silence again, broken only by hunters' feet. The scene of abandonment repeats with variation across the lowlands. In some capitals, palace rooms are swept and sealed before the doorways are bricked, a gesture of dignity by people who believed they would return. In others, fire and ash lie on floors as if enemies sent a message. In yet others, the last inhabitants drag stone from crumbling buildings to build small houses in the lee of a pyramid, a poor shelter that leaves a thin smear of ash and potsherds on top of splendor. Everywhere the forest advances with a patience that no king ever learned. Roots creep into joints in masonry. Leaf litter becomes soil on terraces. Sabre and Ramon throw shade where stucco once blazed white. There are later chapters that scholars have learned to read more clearly in recent decades. LiDAR surveys have shown that the classic heartland was more densely settled than earlier maps allowed, with causeways and terraces and field systems reaching much farther than any traveler can see from a single pyramid stair. That density magnifies every shock. A drought that a sparse countryside could have endured becomes a disaster when tens of thousands depend on reservoirs that all run low together. Intensive farming in Bajos and on thin ridges rings short-term yield from land that then demands a long rest that it is not given. When the rest finally comes, it is because the people have left, not because the rulers have planned it. Even as the southern collapse unfolds, Maya civilization does not end. On the coasts of Belize, salt works continue their quiet industry. In the north, the Puuk towns and Chichen Itza build in stone and continue to write dates. And later, Mayapan binds lineages into a league that governs much of Yucatan, until quarrels and new plagues in the coming centuries scatter that order as well. In the highlands, the Kaish and Kukchikel and other polities rise with their own chronicles and courts and markets. The thread is unbroken from classic to post-classic, to the days when Spaniards arrive with horses and steel and smallpox. The classic collapse is a regional unmaking of a particular way of ruling and building and counting time, not a vanishing of a people. What then broke the crest? The best answer calls many witnesses. Climate records from caves and lakes show clusters of severe droughts between about 800 and 950, some single bad years and some strings of bad years that lasted long enough to spoil harvest after harvest. Environmental evidence shows forests cut hard and soils tired. Archaeology shows fortifications and burning and hurried flight that speak of war intensified by shortage. Epigraphy shows gaps in dynastic sequences, toppled monuments, and broken alliances. Hydrology shows reservoirs contaminated and canals silted. Trade studies show shifts in the flow of obsidian and jade and salt that tell of roads unsafe or markets too weak to bear old burdens. No one cord snaps a great net. Many cords fray until the weight pulls the whole down. Walk a southern capital in the last dry season before the end. The stucco is cracked and chalky. The reservoir lies low, and the water at its edge is green and smells of heat. The market meets with more empty baskets than full ones. Scribes have no fine new shells to drill, and no brushes worth the price of a new codex. A runner arrives at dusk from a hill fortress with word that enemies have cut a causeway and that farmers are drifting toward the lakes. In the night, old men light copal and pray for a rain that does not come. By dawn, a line of families is already filing down the white road with bundles on their backs and a last glance at a roof comb that rises above trees like the back of a sleeping beast. Years later, a hunter crouches under that same roof comb to get out of the rain and does not know the name of the king who once stood there with a bowl of burning paper and thorns in his hand. The classic world of the southern lowlands ended in fragments and migrations, in new towns to the north and on the coasts, and in the long quiet of plazas where leaf litter and time leveled the footfalls of kings. The Maya themselves endured. They kept languages and milpa and story. They learned new gods and kept old ones in disguise, and they walked the ruins as ancestors rather than subjects. What vanished was the dense constellation of divine kingships that had brightened the forest with dates and names. Tonight we have walked a long road through time. We stood on the rooftops of Çatalhöyük, where life mingled with the bones of ancestors. We traced the measured streets and shining wells of the Indus cities and watched their order loosen like a knot in shifting floodplain. We climbed the courts of Crete and felt the island breathe to the rhythm of ships and ceremony before ash, ambition, and earthquake unstitched its palaces. We heard the treaties and chariot wheels of Hattusa and saw how drought, raiders, and broken roads turned a great archive to silence. We moved through the warm green breath of the Gulf lowlands where earth became pyramid and throne and offerings slept beneath the clay, and we watched the old order pass its torch along new rivers. We entered Petra by the narrow gorge and found a kingdom that made water a covenant and stone a scripture, then faded as sea roots and empire rewrote the map. 6 vanished worlds, each with its own genius, and in each the same lesson beneath a different sky. Cities are promises. Water is power. Trade is a vein that can be cut. Law can bind an age and then become a relic in a museum case. Stones endure where voices fail. The ground remembers, in plaster that still bears a palm print, in a drainstone set perfectly level, in a treaty baked hard by a palace fire, in a jade bead that slides cool as river water across the skin, in Nabatean letters that curve toward the script of a later faith. Archaeology is a long conversation with stubborn things. We ask and ask again, and the answers come in fragments that must be placed with patience. When we look back across these ruins, we do not see ghosts in the simple sense. We see decisions, thousands upon thousands, about harvest and worship, about roads and neighbors, about who leads and who follows. Those choices raised courts and markets, and they also cut the first small cracks that time and chance widened. The past is not a single fall from a high wall. It is a loosened thread that finally gives. Wherever you are, may the night be kind. Let the images settle like dust after a long procession. The white rooftops on the Anatolian plain, the cool steps down into the great bath. Lilies painted in a sea wind, lions carved at a gate of stone, a green mask sleeping under clay, a red cliff that opens like a book. Close your eyes and listen for the quiet that follows the crowd. In that quiet, history is still speaking. Thank you for traveling with me. Until we meet again, rest well.